Imagine waking up on another world, red dust beneath your boots, two misshapen moons drifting across an alien sky. For decades, Mars has lived in our imaginations as humanity's next home, the backup planet, the frontier waiting to be conquered. Billionaires want to send 1 million people there. And honestly, it sounds extraordinary, but what if Mars doesn't want us there? If you love staring up at the night sky and wondering what's out there, make sure to give this video a like. Now let's get started. Why do we even want to go to Mars in the first place? It's not a random choice. Of all the planets in our solar system, Mars is, by almost every measure, the least terrible option. Venus would melt you alive. Its surface temperature sits at around 460 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead. Mercury swings between 430 degrees in sunlight and minus 180 in the dark, with no real atmosphere to buffer anything. Mars at least has days that are nearly the same length as ours, 24 hours and 37 minutes, close enough that your body clock wouldn't completely fall apart. It has seasons, driven by an axial tilt of about 25 degrees, remarkably similar to Earth's 23.5. It has an atmosphere, razor thin as it is, towering volcanoes and canyon systems that would make anything on Earth look like a minor geological footnote, and it has a kind of brutal, desolate beauty that speaks to something ancient in the human spirit. Explorers have always been drawn to the harshest places on Earth, and Mars is about as harsh as anything within reachable distance. But the moment you move past the romance and start looking at what daily survival would actually require, the picture that forms is not inspiring. It's genuinely sobering. Let's look at Mars honestly, starting with the very air you'd be trying to breathe. The moment you stepped outside any pressurized habitat on Mars without a fully sealed suit, you would lose consciousness in roughly 15 seconds. You wouldn't suffocate gradually. You wouldn't have time to feel afraid. The near-vacuum conditions would cause the gases dissolved in your blood to rapidly expand, a process called ebullition, and your lungs would rupture from the catastrophic pressure difference. It would be over before your brain had time to process what was happening. There would be no dramatic last breath, just silence. The Martian atmosphere is roughly 1% of Earth's atmospheric pressure at sea level. To give that some context, the summit of Mount Everest sits at about 30% of sea level pressure, and climbers already require supplemental oxygen just to stay conscious up there. The very top of the highest mountain on Earth feels like a luxury spa compared to the average afternoon on the Martian surface. But the thinness of the air is only part of the problem. What that thin atmosphere is actually made of is the other half of the nightmare. Approximately 95% of Mars's atmosphere is carbon dioxide. The remaining 5% is a mixture of nitrogen, argon, and trace amounts of other gases, including so little free oxygen that even if the pressure were somehow magically Earth-like, you still couldn't breathe it. There is essentially no accessible oxygen on the surface of Mars. Now, and this is where the science gets genuinely exciting, even as the situation stays terrifying, NASA's Perseverance rover, which landed in Jezero crater in February of 2021, carried a small experimental device called MOXIE, the Mars Oxygen in Situ Resource Utilization Experiment. MOXIE successfully converted carbon dioxide in the Martian atmosphere into breathable oxygen using a process called solid oxide electrolysis, essentially running the chemistry in reverse from what your lungs do. That is a landmark achievement. It proves the concept is physically possible on Mars, but here is where the scale of the problem becomes stark. MOXIE, operating at its best, produces about 10 grams of oxygen per hour. A resting adult human needs roughly 30 grams of oxygen per hour just to survive. The moment you're doing physical work, construction, repairs, moving equipment, dealing with any kind of emergency, that number climbs considerably. Scaling Moxie to support even a modest colony of 100 people would require industrial-scale machinery that dwarfs anything humanity has ever launched beyond Earth. And that machinery would have to run without significant failure, continuously every single hour of every single day. Because on Mars, there is no stepping outside for a breath of fresh air. There is no natural safety net. The atmosphere is not a resource waiting to be used. It is an obstacle to be overcome at enormous cost and complexity. And that complexity, that constant reliance on technology, that must never meaningfully fail. That is a thread you're going to see running through everything we discussed today. Mars forces you into a relationship with machinery and engineering that has no margin for error, none. But the atmosphere is just the beginning. What's happening above that atmosphere might actually be even more dangerous, and it's something that's been reshaping our entire understanding of what long-duration human spaceflight requires. Right now, as you watch this, you are being protected by two invisible shields that you've almost certainly never thought about. Together, they are the reason complex life exists on this planet at all. The first is Earth's magnetic field, a planet-wide force field generated by the movement of liquid iron alloys deep in our outer core. This magnetosphere deflects the most energetic particles streaming from the Sun, high-speed protons, electrons, and the violent plasma ejections that follow solar flares. Without it, the solar wind would relentlessly strip our atmosphere away, layer by layer, over geological timescales. It would also irradiate the surface to the point where DNA repair mechanisms in living cells simply couldn't keep up. The second shield is the atmosphere itself. Even for the radiation that does penetrate the magnetosphere, the thick blanket of air above us absorbs and scatters the majority of it long before it reaches the ground. Mars has neither of these in any meaningful form, and the story of how it lost them is one of the most important cautionary tales in planetary science. Mars lost its global magnetic field somewhere around 4 billion years ago. The leading scientific explanation is that Mars's interior cooled and solidified far more quickly than Earth's. Because Mars is smaller, it has a higher surface area to volume ratio, meaning it radiates heat away faster. As the core solidified, the churning motion of liquid metal that generates a magnetic field, the same dynamo effect powering Earth's magnetosphere, shut down. The field collapsed, and without that protection, the young Martian atmosphere was gradually stripped away by the solar wind over hundreds of millions of years. The evidence for this ancient magnetic field is actually beautiful in its own way. Ancient rocks in Mars's southern highlands are magnetized, their minerals locked into alignment with a field that no longer exists, like a fossil compass frozen in time. NASA's MAVEN mission, the Mars's atmosphere and volatile evolution spacecraft, which has been orbiting Mars since 2014, has directly measured the solar wind stripping ions from the Martian atmosphere in real time, confirming exactly this mechanism at work. What remains today are scattered, localized magnetic anomalies in the southern crust, the last echoes of that ancient protection. They cover tiny areas and offer essentially no shielding to anything on the surface. So what does unshielded life on Mars actually look like in terms of radiation exposure? NASA's Curiosity rover has been providing the answer since it landed in Gale Crater in August of 2012. It carries a radiation detection instrument called RAD, the Radiation Assessment Detector, and the data it's gathered is striking. An astronaut standing on the Martian surface would receive a radiation dose of approximately 300 microsieverts per day just from background radiation. To make that meaningful, most countries set the annual radiation limit for nuclear power plant workers at around 20 millisieverts per year. On Mars, you would hit that same dose in roughly 67 days. NASA's current career radiation limit for astronauts is pegged to a threshold representing a 3% increased lifetime risk of fatal cancer. A surface mission of 500 days, which is actually a conservative estimate for a crewed Mars landing when you account for the travel time and mission operations, would likely push well past that limit by conventional calculations. And that's before we even factor in solar particle events. These are sudden, intense bursts of radiation following large solar flares that can spike surface radiation levels by orders of magnitude, sometimes with only minutes of warning. During a major solar particle event, being outside in a standard spacesuit on Mars could deliver a potentially fatal dose in a matter of hours. The engineering responses being considered include building habitats underground, carving into cliff faces, or piling several meters of Martian soil, called regolith, on top of surface structures to act as shielding. These approaches are physically feasible, but they raise a profound question about what kind of existence that actually is. You would spend the majority of your life on Mars buried underground, shielded from a sky you could never safely look up at without protection, breathing manufactured air, dependent on machines for every single biological need. It's worth pausing on that for a moment. We talk about Mars colonization with such excitement, such forward momentum, but the day-to-day reality wouldn't feel like a frontier adventure. It would feel like being permanently trapped in a bunker on a world that is actively trying to kill you through multiple simultaneous mechanisms. Speaking of multiple mechanisms trying to keep humans away from the stars, if what we've covered so far is giving you that unsettling feeling of just how hostile the cosmos actually is, check out the video on the card above, where we explore why interstellar travel gets more terrifying the further you go. Everything we're discussing today about Mars scales up in ways that will genuinely unsettle you when you see the full picture. The link is in the description and pinned on the comments, because the challenges of Mars are just the first chapter of a much bigger story about what the universe is like for living things trying to move through it. But here's what we haven't talked about yet, and this might be the detail that surprises you most. The radiation and the atmosphere are dangerous, yes, but there's something in the Martian soil itself, something that has been sitting there for billions of years, baked in by the same ultraviolet radiation that makes the surface so hostile. And when planetary scientists fully understood what it was and how much of it is there, it changed the entire conversation about whether humans could ever grow food on Mars, work in the soil, or even safely handle the ground beneath their feet. What is it? We're going into that in part 2, and trust me, you're going to want to hear this one. So let's talk about the dirt. It sounds almost mundane, doesn't it? Dirt, soil, the stuff beneath your feet. On Earth, soil is alive, genuinely biologically alive. A single teaspoon of healthy topsoil contains more microorganisms than there are people on this planet. It's a living ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, nematodes, and organic compounds built up over millions of years of geological and biological activity. It holds moisture, it cycles nutrients, it is in the most literal sense the foundation of all terrestrial food production. Every crop, every vegetable, every fruit that has ever sustained a human civilization grew from this living, breathing substance we barely give a second thought to. Martian regolith, the scientific word for the loose surface material covering Mars, is the opposite of all of that in almost every conceivable way. And the reason comes down to something that planetary scientists began piecing together from orbital data and rover measurements over years of careful work. The Martian surface has been exposed to intense ultraviolet radiation for billions of years, radiation that, thanks to the missing atmosphere and absent magnetic field we just discussed, reaches the ground largely unfiltered. That radiation, combined with the particular chemistry of the Martian crust, has driven a series of chemical reactions that produced something genuinely alarming in large quantities across the surface, perchlorates. Perchlorates are a family of chemical compounds, salts of perchloric acid, and they exist in Martian regolith at concentrations that would be considered a major environmental hazard by every standard we use here on Earth. The Phoenix lander first confirmed their presence in 2008 when it sampled soil in Mars's northern polar region. Subsequent missions confirmed they're not localized. They appear to be distributed globally, found across widely separated sites, embedded in the very substance of the Martian surface. At concentrations found on Mars, estimated at roughly 0.5 to 1% by weight in many locations, perchlorates are toxic to humans. They disrupt the thyroid gland by blocking iodine uptake, interfering with hormone production in ways that affect metabolism, growth, and cognitive function. Chronic low-level exposure is serious enough. High-level acute exposure is worse. Here on Earth, environmental perchlorate contamination from industrial sites and rocket fuel manufacturing is treated as a significant public health concern requiring active remediation, and Mars has it everywhere, built into the ground at levels that would trigger emergency cleanup protocols if found in a drinking water source on this planet. Now, you might be thinking, well, surely you just avoid touching the soil, you stay in your habitat, you wear your suit, you're careful. And that logic works until you start thinking through what a real Martian settlement would actually require. Day to day, spacesuits get dusty. Mars is extraordinarily dusty. We'll come back to just how extraordinarily dusty in a moment. And Martian dust is fine enough to cling electrostatically to almost any surface. That dust carries perchlorates. Every time an astronaut re-enters a habitat through an airlock, some of that dust comes with them. Seals degrade, filters clog. Any agricultural operation growing food in Martian greenhouses, which every long-term colonization plan depends on, would require handling regolith directly or dealing extensively with it as a substrate. You cannot simply pretend it isn't there. And growing food in Martian soil presents an additional layer of complication beyond the perchlorates. Healthy plant growth requires nitrogen-accessible compounds, nitrates and ammonium salts that plants can metabolize. Martian soil is severely depleted of these. It also lacks the organic matter, the microbial communities, and the complex mineral balance that Earth soils provide naturally. Experiments with Earth plants grown in simulated Martian regolith, including research published in the International Journal of Astrobiology, have consistently shown that plants either struggle enormously or fail to grow at all without significant soil amendment. The famous scene in the film The Martian, where an astronaut grows potatoes in Martian soil using human waste as fertilizer, is engaging cinema. As science, it glosses over a chemical obstacle course that would take years of soil engineering to even partially address. You would essentially need to build soil from scratch, importing or manufacturing nutrients, neutralizing perchlorates through chemical treatment or bioremediation, and creating growing conditions in a completely artificial, controlled environment. All of this while maintaining every other life support system simultaneously. All of this on a planet where every component, every chemical, every replacement part either has to survive the journey from Earth or be manufactured on-site from local materials, a field called in situ resource utilization, which is still largely in its experimental infancy. The regolith problem alone reframes the entire agricultural dream of Mars. It doesn't make it impossible. Human ingenuity is genuinely remarkable and should not be underestimated. But it transforms the vision of colonists farming red Martian fields under a pale sky into something far more clinical and far more difficult: sealed hydroponic systems, carefully curated chemical environments, perpetual energy expenditure just to keep the growing conditions stable. Now, let's talk about that dust more specifically, because it deserves its own conversation. Martian dust is unlike anything found in an Earth desert. The particles are extraordinarily fine, on the order of a few micrometers in diameter, finer than talcum powder, and they carry an electrostatic charge that makes them cling aggressively to surfaces. Solar panels get coated in a matter of weeks, optical instruments degrade, mechanical seals can be compromised, the dust permeates everything it touches, and then, periodically, Mars goes to another level entirely. Global dust storms on Mars are among the most dramatic meteorological events in the solar system. They can begin as relatively localized regional storms, and then, under the right conditions, expand until they encircle the entire planet, a world-spanning wall of suspended dust that blots out the sun for weeks or even months at a time. The mechanism driving this expansion is fascinating and terrifying in equal measure. As dust lofts into the atmosphere, it absorbs solar radiation and heats the air around it, which drives stronger winds, which loft more dust, which heats more air. It becomes self-sustaining on a planetary scale. We've watched this happen in real time. The global dust storm of 2018 is the one that ended the Opportunity rover's mission, a machine that had operated on Mars for nearly 15 Earth years. As the storm intensified and spread, the dust blocking the sunlight reduced power generation from Opportunity's solar panels to the point where the rover could no longer function. Its last communications was received on June 10, 2018. Despite hundreds of attempts to re-establish contact over the following months, it never responded again. NASA officially declared the mission over in February of 2019, after Opportunity had traveled more than 45 kilometers across the Martian surface, a distance that had exceeded every expectation, a testament to extraordinary engineering. But a dust storm ended it anyway. For a human settlement, a global dust storm creates a compound crisis. Solar power generation collapses. If your colony is substantially dependent on solar energy, and most current designs are, at least partially, your power supply becomes critically stressed precisely when you need it most. Meanwhile, dust infiltrates systems, clogs filters, degrades seals, and forces crew members into prolonged confinement. A storm that lasts 2 to 3 months, which historical observations suggest is well within the range of Martian dust storm behavior, means months of reduced power, potential equipment failures, and the kind of sustained psychological pressure that we know from both spaceflight psychology and isolated environment research can push people towards serious mental health crises. The proposed solution most often cited is nuclear power, specifically small fission reactors like NASA's Kilopower project, which successfully tested a small space nuclear reactor system in 2018. Nuclear power is not affected by dust. It generates heat and electricity independent of the sun. For long-duration Mars operations, it may ultimately be unavoidable as the primary power source. But nuclear reactors bring their own engineering complexities, their own failure modes, their own mass and logistics challenges. You swap one constraint for another. There's a version of the Mars story that gets told in promotional materials that goes something like this. Yes, Mars is cold, but it can reach temperatures of around 20 degrees Celsius near the equator on a summer afternoon. That's almost pleasant. That's a chilly autumn day in northern Europe, and that is technically true. On a summer afternoon at the equator under direct sunlight, the surface temperature on Mars can creep toward the low 20s. If you were standing there in a perfectly engineered spacesuit, that particular data point would feel almost optimistic, but averages tell a different story. The average surface temperature on Mars is approximately minus 60 degrees Celsius, 60 degrees below zero, planet-wide as a mean, and the swings are brutal. Temperatures at the poles during winter plunge to around minus 125 degrees Celsius, cold enough to cause carbon dioxide itself to freeze out of the atmosphere and form dry ice polar caps. Even at the equator, night temperatures regularly drop below -70. These temperature extremes have profound implications for materials, machinery, and the human body. Metals contract, lubricants become viscous or solid, electronics behave unpredictably. Seals that work at room temperature can become brittle and fail in deep cold. Every material used in construction, every component in every piece of life support equipment, every joint in every spacesuit has to be engineered to function across a temperature range that would destroy standard Earth-built hardware. The thermal management challenge for a Martian habitat is enormous. You need to keep the interior warm enough for human survival, around 20 degrees Celsius at minimum, while the exterior is potentially -70 or colder. That's a temperature differential of roughly 90 degrees across your habitat walls. Maintaining that differential requires continuous energy input, constant heating systems, and insulation engineering that has to work perfectly and indefinitely. Any failure in the heating system during a Martian night isn't an inconvenience, it's a survival emergency. The rovers have given us hard data on this. Curiosity's weather station, the Rover Environmental Monitoring System, or REMS, has recorded daily temperature swings of around 70 to 80 degrees Celsius in a single Martian day, not seasonal variation, a single day. Sunrise brings relatively rapid warming. Nightfall brings crushing cold. Any human infrastructure has to expand, contract, and survive this thermal cycling not just once, but thousands of times over the course of a mission. And here is what unifies everything we've talked about so far: the atmosphere, the radiation, the perchlorates, the dust, the cold. None of these problems exist in isolation on Mars. They compound each other. A dust storm reduces power, which stresses thermal management systems, which increases the risk of heating failure, which makes equipment more vulnerable to cold-induced mechanical failure, which threatens life support, which endangers the people depending on all of it to function simultaneously. Complex systems under stress don't fail one thing at a time, they cascade. And on Mars, there is no rescue mission you can call, there is no emergency service, there is no hospital, there is no quick way home. The journey from Earth to Mars, when the planets are at their closest approach, an alignment called opposition, takes roughly 6 to 9 months with current propulsion technology. The planets only reach a favorable alignment for the return journey, roughly every 26 months. This means that if a serious crisis develops in your Martian colony, a medical emergency, a life support failure, a cascade of equipment problems, the response time from Earth for any physical assistance is not hours or days, it's years. You are on your own in a way that no previous human explorer in history has ever truly been. We've covered the soil, the dust, the cold, and the compounding nature of how these threats interact. But there's an entire dimension of the Mars survival problem we haven't touched yet, and it's one that doesn't get nearly enough attention in the public conversation, possibly because it's harder to photograph and harder to dramatize than a dust storm or a frozen landscape. It's what the Martian environment does to the human body over time, from the inside. The biological changes that begin accumulating from the very first day you leave Earth's gravity well, and that accelerate with every passing month in the low-gravity environment of Mars. Some of these changes are reversible. Some of them, the research increasingly suggests, may not be. That is where we're going now, and the findings from long-duration spaceflight research, from the ISS, from twin studies, from bone density analyses and cardiovascular data, paint a picture of the human body under Mars conditions that should fundamentally change how we think about permanent settlement. Let's talk about your body, not in an abstract, theoretical way. Your actual body, the one you're sitting in right now, the one that evolved over roughly 3.8 billion years of life on this planet, shaped by every force Earth has to offer: gravity, atmospheric pressure, magnetic shielding, a specific blend of gases, a particular range of temperatures, circadian rhythms tuned to a 24-hour day driven by a sun at a specific distance. Your body is not a generic biological machine that can be dropped into any environment and expected to perform. It is an exquisitely specialized product of this world, calibrated to Earth's conditions down to the cellular level, and Mars, in almost every measurable way, is the wrong world for it. Mars has a surface gravity of about 3.7 meters per second squared. Earth's is 9.8. That means Martian gravity is roughly 38% of what you feel right now. If you weigh 70 kilograms on Earth, you'd weigh about 26.5 on Mars. You'd feel lighter, you could jump higher, carrying equipment would feel easier. In the short term, that might even feel liberating, but your body would be paying a price you couldn't feel. Not at first. Here's what we know from decades of research on astronauts aboard the International Space Station. Microgravity, zero gravity essentially, causes dramatic, measurable physiological changes across multiple organ systems simultaneously. Mars's gravity is not zero, but it is profoundly reduced, and the evidence strongly suggests that reduced gravity drives many of the same processes, just at a somewhat slower rate. Bone loss is the most widely documented effect. In microgravity, the human skeleton loses density at a rate of roughly 1 to 2% per month in the most affected regions: the lower spine, the hip, the femur. These are load-bearing bones, the ones that your skeleton keeps dense and strong, precisely because gravity constantly demands it. Remove that gravitational load and your body, with ruthless biological efficiency, stops investing in maintaining bone mass it perceives as unnecessary. The cells that build bone, osteoblasts, slow their activity. The cells that break it down, osteoclasts, continue at their normal pace. The result is a skeleton that becomes progressively more fragile. Countermeasures developed for the ISS, 2 hours of vigorous daily exercise using specialized resistance equipment, have significantly reduced but not eliminated this effect, and that's in full microgravity. On Mars, with 38% gravity, the situation might be somewhat better, but research published in journals including MPJ Microgravity has raised genuine questions about whether Martian gravity is sufficient to fully prevent the bone loss cascade, or whether it merely slows it. We don't yet know the answer with certainty, because no human has ever lived in 38% gravity for an extended period. The data from the ISS applies to near-zero gravity. Mars is uncharted physiological territory. Muscle mass follows a similar trajectory. Without the constant gravitational loading that drives muscle maintenance on Earth, skeletal muscle atrophies. The legs are especially vulnerable. They exist largely to carry you upright against Earth's pull. Astronauts returning from 6-month ISS missions frequently cannot walk unassisted immediately upon return to Earth. They require weeks or months of rehabilitation to regain normal function. Their cardiovascular systems have partially deconditioned. Their sense of balance is disrupted. Their bodies have adapted, efficiently and blindly, to an environment they're no longer in. Now imagine that adaptation happening not for 6 months, but for years. Not in microgravity, from which you eventually return to Earth, but in the partial gravity of Mars, a gravity level your body was never designed for, not high enough to maintain your Earth-adapted physiology, not low enough that we've studied it extensively enough to know exactly what the long-term consequences are. There is a particularly concerning possibility raised by some researchers, that humans who spend their formative years or their entire adult lives in Martian gravity may find themselves permanently compromised for return to Earth. Their skeletons, their cardiovascular systems, their muscular architecture, all recalibrated to a world that is only 38% as demanding as the one their biology was built for. A person who grew up on Mars might never be able to survive on Earth at all. That's not a fringe idea. That's a sober inference from well-established physiological principles. And it raises a profound ethical question that the colonization conversation rarely grapples with directly. If you take a child to Mars, are you making a decision on their behalf that they can never undo? Are you closing a door for them that they never had the chance to choose to close themselves? The heart is a pump, and like any pump, it calibrates its output to the demands placed on it. In microgravity, the cardiovascular system undergoes a remarkable and troubling shift. With gravity no longer pulling blood preferentially toward the lower body, fluid redistributes upward toward the chest and head. The heart initially reads this as an increase in blood volume and responds by reducing it, excreting fluid and shrinking its own mass. Astronauts on the ISS experience a measurable reduction in cardiac muscle mass and a change in the heart's geometry. It becomes more spherical, less efficient as a pump over the course of a 6-month mission. Additionally, fluid redistribution toward the head causes what astronauts commonly describe as a constant feeling of nasal congestion and facial puffiness. More seriously, it increases intracranial pressure, the pressure inside the skull, and elevated intracranial pressure sustained over months has been linked to a condition called Spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, or SANS. This involves structural changes to the eyes and optic nerves. The optic disc becomes swollen, the eyeball flattens slightly. The visual acuity of some astronauts has been measurably degraded after long missions. Scott Kelly, the NASA astronaut, who spent nearly a full year aboard the ISS in a landmark study comparing his physiology to his identical twin brother Mark, who remained on Earth, showed evidence of these intracranial changes. His telomere dynamics shifted, his gene expression changed in ways that partly but not fully reversed upon return. The study, published in Science in 2019, remains one of the most detailed examinations of long-duration spaceflight's biological impact ever conducted. And what it showed was not reassuring for anyone planning to spend years beyond Earth's protective environment. On Mars, the partial gravity would reduce but not eliminate these fluid distribution issues. The cardiovascular deconditioning would likely proceed more slowly than on the ISS. But slowly is not the same as not at all. Over months and years in Martian gravity, the cumulative cardiovascular changes could be substantial. And on a world with no hospitals, no cardiologists, and no emergency surgical capabilities, a cardiovascular event is not just a medical crisis. It's almost certainly fatal. This one is less intuitive but no less important. The immune system, it turns out, doesn't function normally in space. Research from ISS missions has documented that the immune response becomes dysregulated in microgravity, not simply weakened in a straightforward way, but altered in its behavior. Some immune responses are suppressed, others become overactive, latent viruses that the immune system normally keeps dormant, including members of the herpes virus family, such as the Epstein-Barr virus and the varicella zoster virus that causes chickenpox and shingles, have been shown to reactivate in astronauts during spaceflight. A study published in Frontiers in Microbiology in 2019 found that astronauts shed significantly higher levels of these reactivated viruses during spaceflight than before or after. In most cases, this didn't produce acute illness. The immune system, even altered, managed to keep symptoms at bay, but reactivated viruses are replicating and could potentially spread among a small, confined crew in ways that might not manifest until the cumulative immune burden becomes too great, and the confined crew aspect matters enormously. A Martian colony, especially in its early stages, would be a small group of people living in extremely close quarters, sharing air, sharing surfaces, under continuous physical and psychological stress, all of which are known to suppress immune function while being irradiated at levels that damage DNA and potentially compromise cellular repair mechanisms. The immune environment on Mars would be unlike anything we've studied in controlled conditions. There's an additional microbiome dimension worth mentioning here. The human gut microbiome, the vast community of microorganisms living in your digestive system, which plays crucial roles in immune regulation, nutrient absorption, and even mental health, is highly sensitive to diet, stress, and environment. The restricted, processed diet available on Mars, combined with the stress and isolation of the mission, would likely alter gut microbiome composition in ways we don't fully understand. Research into the gut-brain axis, the two-way communication system between your digestive microbiome and your brain, is still young, but early findings suggest that microbiome disruption can contribute to anxiety, depression, and cognitive changes. In an environment that is already psychologically brutal, this is not a minor footnote. We talked about radiation in Part 1, primarily in the context of cancer risk. But ionizing radiation has another effect that has only come into sharp focus in recent years: direct neurological damage. Research conducted at NASA's Space Radiation Laboratory, where scientists use particle accelerators to simulate the kind of high-energy cosmic radiation found in deep space, has shown that exposure to the energetic particles that Mars-bound astronauts would encounter causes measurable cognitive impairment in animal models. Studies using mice and rats exposed to simulated deep space radiation have found deficits in memory, reduced cognitive flexibility, increased anxiety-like behavior, and structural changes in the hippocampus, the brain region central to learning and memory formation. A study published in Scientific Reports in 2017 found that rodents exposed to simulated deep space radiation showed signs of what the researchers described as cosmic ray dementia, a concerning term for a concerning phenomenon. The brain, like bone and muscle, is a tissue that radiation damages in specific and potentially cumulative ways. And unlike bone density, which at least partially recovers upon return to Earth's gravity, neurological damage from radiation exposure may be permanent. Charles Limerly, a radiation oncology researcher at the University of California, Irvine, who has been at the forefront of this research, has described the findings as presenting a real problem for deep space travel. The particles responsible, particularly high charge, high energy ions from cosmic rays, penetrate standard shielding with relative ease and interact with brain tissue in ways that trigger neuroinflammation and disrupt neural signaling. For a Mars mission, the transit alone, 6 to 9 months each way, represents significant exposure time outside Earth's magnetosphere. The surface mission adds more. Estimates suggest that cognitive performance in some astronauts could be measurably degraded by the end of a full Mars mission timeline. And then there's the psychological dimension, which is inseparable from the neurological one. Isolation, confinement, the knowledge that help is impossibly far away, the monotony of a carefully regimented survival routine, the absence of natural environments, the absence of privacy, these are not trivial quality of life concerns. They are documented drivers of serious psychological deterioration in analog studies of isolated environments. Research from Antarctic overwintering stations, some of the closest Earth-based analogues to Mars mission conditions, has found that prolonged isolation and confinement produce a recognizable syndrome including cognitive slowing, emotional blunting, interpersonal conflict, and a kind of psychological withdrawal that researchers call the third quarter phenomenon, a period of pronounced morale decline typically occurring about 2/3 of the way through a long isolated mission. The Mars 500 study conducted in Moscow between 2010 and 2011 simulated a 520-day Mars mission using 6 volunteers confined in a sealed facility. Results showed significant sleep disruptions, sedentary behavior increases, mild cognitive changes, and notable psychological stress. And that was in a facility on Earth, where the participants knew they could leave in an emergency, where there was no radiation, no actual life support dependency, and no genuine existential threat. The real thing would be categorically more demanding. So we have a picture now that is striking in its comprehensiveness. Mars attacks the human body from multiple directions simultaneously. It erodes your bones, strains your heart, confuses your immune system, potentially damages your brain, and burdens your mind in ways that compound with every passing month. And I want to step back here and say something clearly, because this isn't meant to crush the dream. These challenges are known. They are being studied. Brilliant researchers at NASA, at the European Space Agency, at universities around the world are working on countermeasures, on pharmaceutical interventions, on engineering solutions, on better understanding of what the human body actually needs to survive and function in these conditions. Science doesn't just document problems, it solves them. That's the whole point. That's the adventure, but the solutions are not yet in hand, not fully, and the gap between we are working on this and we have solved this well enough to safely send people there permanently is enormous. And that gap tends to get minimized in the public conversation, in the press releases, in the enthusiasm of people who want this to happen so badly that the obstacles sometimes blur into background noise. We are made of stardust, yes. Every atom in your body was forged in the heart of a dying star, scattered across space, gathered by gravity into a world that was, against extraordinary odds, precisely the right kind of place for carbon chemistry to become something as remarkable as you. That is a genuinely profound truth, and it cuts both ways. We are made of stardust shaped by Earth. Taking us away from Earth is not a trivial relocation. It is a challenge to the very conditions that made us possible. There's one more dimension to the human challenge on Mars that we haven't touched, and it might be the one that determines whether any settlement survives long-term, more than any engineering consideration. How do humans actually behave when you put a small group of them in a sealed box on a hostile world with no escape, no privacy, no outside help, and stakes that could not be higher? What happens to decision-making, to leadership, to relationships, to the social fabric of a tiny community when the margin for error is zero? The answer, from every analog study, from every long-duration mission, from everything we know about human psychology under extreme stress, is complicated. And sometimes, deeply troubling, that's where we are going now. And it might be the most human chapter of this entire story. If you are enjoying this journey, make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. You will be part of a community that explores the cosmos together. Let's talk about people. Because here's the thing about every single engineering challenge we've discussed so far: the atmosphere, the radiation, the perchlorates, the cold, the bone loss, the cardiovascular strain, the neurological risks. Every single one of those problems has to be solved by human beings. People working together, people making decisions under pressure, people who are tired, who are stressed, who haven't seen sunlight in weeks, who are sharing a space roughly the size of a large apartment with the same small group of faces, day after day after day, on a world that is trying to kill them in at least 6 different ways simultaneously. And we have a tendency, when we talk about Mars missions, to treat the human element as a kind of footnote. We spend enormous energy on rocket propulsion and habitat design, and radiation shielding and life support redundancy. We treat the engineering problems as the real problems and the human problems as something that can be managed with careful crew selection and good protocols. But the research tells a different story. In study after study, in analog mission after analog mission, in every isolated and confined environment we've ever sent human beings into for extended periods, the human element doesn't end up being a footnote. It ends up being the central challenge. It ends up being the thing that determines whether a mission succeeds or collapses. And understanding why requires understanding something fundamental about how human beings are built. We are, at our core, social animals, not in a soft, vague, feel-good sense, in a hard neurobiological sense. Social connection is not a luxury for humans. It is a physiological need, as real and as urgent as food or water or sleep. Loneliness and social isolation activate the same stress response systems in the brain as physical pain and physical threat. Prolonged isolation elevates cortisol, disrupts sleep architecture, impairs immune function, and drives structural change in brain regions associated with emotional regulation. Solitary confinement is considered a form of torture by international human rights bodies, not because of the physical conditions, but because of what isolation alone does to the human mind. Now, you might say, but Mars colonists wouldn't be alone. They'd be with a crew. There would be other people there. And yes, there would be. A small, fixed, unchanging group of people. The same faces every single morning. The same voices in every conversation. The same interpersonal dynamics playing out in an enclosed space where there is nowhere to go, no one else to talk to, no change of scenery, no social refreshment of any kind. For months, possibly for years, possibly for the rest of their lives if we're talking about permanent settlement. Human social systems are not designed to function optimally in those conditions. We evolved in communities of varying size, with the ability to move between social groups, to seek out new relationships, to retreat from conflict, to find privacy when we need it and company when we need that. We evolved with nature around us, with open skies, with changing seasons, with the biological rhythms that sunlight and darkness drive at a cellular level through hormones like melatonin and cortisol. Strip all of that away, and what you're left with is a group of human beings trying to maintain cognitive performance, emotional stability, cooperative behavior, and effective decision-making under conditions that actively work against all four of those things. The research from analog environments is instructive and sometimes alarming. Antarctic research stations, particularly those at places like Concordia, the Franco-Italian facility located on the East Antarctic Plateau, which experiences months of complete polar night and total isolation, have been studied intensively as Mars analogues. Researchers have documented what they call the winter over syndrome, a constellation of symptoms including sleep disturbance, mild cognitive impairment, irritability, social withdrawal, and a flattening of emotional affect that develops over the course of a prolonged Antarctic stay. The people experiencing this are not psychologically fragile. They are carefully selected scientists and engineers, people who passed rigorous assessments. The environment does it to them anyway. Interpersonal conflict in confined, isolated groups follows predictable patterns. Initial cohesion gives way over time to the accumulation of small irritations, the way someone breathes, the way someone chews, the way someone laughs at the wrong moment. These micro-irritations, which would be trivial in a normal social environment where you could simply go somewhere else and reset, become magnified in confinement. In an environment where there is nowhere else to go, where every social interaction carries the weight of total dependence, these people are literally your life support network. Small conflicts can grow into serious fractures. Commander-crew dynamics become particularly fraught. Studies from submarine crews, Antarctic stations, and space station simulations have found that authority conflicts, disputes about decision-making, about protocols, about who has the right to override whom in a given situation, are among the most destabilizing forces in confined group settings. A crew member who loses confidence in their commander in a conventional work setting can simply find another job. A crew member who loses confidence in their commander on Mars has no such option. They have to continue functioning with that person, depending on that person, possibly having their survival determined by that person's decisions. The Biosphere 2 experiment, the famous project in Arizona in the early 1990s where 8 people were sealed inside a giant glass and steel structure designed to be a self-sustaining ecological system, offers one of the most cited cautionary tales about small group dynamics in enclosed environments. By the end of the 2-year experiment, the 8 crew members had split into 2 factions that were barely speaking to each other. The conflict wasn't driven by any single dramatic event. It was accumulated tension, disagreement about priorities, personality friction, and the relentless pressure of close confinement with no exit. If the survival of your colony depends on those 8 people cooperating flawlessly, you have a problem. And here's what makes this more complicated still. The communication lag between Mars and Earth makes mission control support for conflict resolution essentially impossible in real time. At its closest approach, Mars is about 54 million kilometers from Earth. At its farthest, over 400 million. Radio signals travel at the speed of light, roughly 300,000 kilometers per second. Even at closest approach, a signal from Mars takes about 3 minutes to reach Earth and 3 minutes for any response to return. At typical mission distances, you're looking at communication delays of anywhere from 3 to 22 minutes each way. That means a 6 to 44-minute round trip for any exchange of information. You cannot have a real conversation. You cannot call mission control in an emergency and get immediate guidance. You send a message describing your crisis, and then you wait for potentially 44 minutes for someone on Earth to respond. And by then, the situation may have already resolved itself or killed someone. This communication delay has profound implications not just for psychological support and conflict resolution, but for every emergency response on Mars. Medical emergency? Wait 44 minutes for a doctor's response. Structural failure in a habitat module? You're making that call yourself. Radiation alarm? You're not waiting for Earth's permission to act. The crew on Mars will have to be, to an extraordinary degree, autonomous, capable of diagnosing and solving problems they've never encountered before, under conditions that are already taxing their cognitive and emotional resources. That autonomy requirement sits in uncomfortable tension with another documented phenomenon in isolated groups. Decision-making degrades under prolonged stress and sleep deprivation. The cognitive impairments that build up in isolated, confined environments, the ones we've seen in Antarctic crews, in submarine crews, in simulated Mars missions, are exactly the kind of impairments that make autonomous, high-stakes decision-making more dangerous. The people who most need to make good decisions independently are being gradually rendered less capable of making them by the very environment they're in. There's a term used in human factors research, behavioral health, that covers this entire landscape of psychological, social, and cognitive functioning in extreme environments. NASA takes it seriously. The agency has invested significantly in developing behavioral health monitoring systems and psychological countermeasures for long-duration missions. Crew selection processes are exhaustive and specifically designed to identify individuals with the psychological resilience, emotional intelligence, and conflict resolution skills that extended isolation demands. But there is a limit to how much selection and preparation can do. You can pick the best possible people, you can train them extensively, you can give them communication tools, mental health resources, carefully designed living spaces, structured routines, and they will still be human beings with all of the beautiful and sometimes catastrophic complexity that entails, trying to hold together on a world that offers nothing to sustain the human spirit without engineering. Because here's what Mars does not have and cannot provide, and cannot simulate no matter how cleverly you design the habitat: the open sky, the smell of rain, the sound of wind through trees, the feeling of grass underfoot, a sunset over the ocean, a walk alone through a forest, all of the things that human beings have understood long before neuroscience gave us the vocabulary to explain why, to be restorative. The things that refill what depletion empties. The experiences that remind you, below the level of conscious thought, that you are alive in a world that holds you. Mars has none of that. Mars has regolith and radiation, and a sky that would kill you if you tried to breathe it, and a sun that looks small and cold from 93 million kilometers further away than it does from Earth. The psychological environment of Mars is not just the absence of comfort. It is the active presence of an alien world that is indifferent to human existence in the most complete and literal way possible. And something that the most thoughtful writers on long-duration spaceflight have begun to grapple with is this: for permanent settlers, people who go to Mars not on a rotating mission, but with the intention of staying, the psychological stakes are categorically different from those of a time-limited expedition. When you know you're going home, you can endure an enormous amount. Humans have endured extraordinary hardship throughout history when there was an endpoint in sight, a return, a reunion, a future shaped by familiar things. But permanence changes the psychological equation entirely. Permanent settlers on Mars would have to come to terms, genuinely, deeply, at every level of their psychology, with the fact that they will never again stand in open air, never again feel natural sunlight without a visor, never again be part of a living, breathing, biologically rich world, never again be home. That is not a problem that better habitat design or more communication bandwidth solves. It is a fundamentally human question about meaning, about identity, about what we are willing to give up and what we cannot survive giving up. And it is a question that we have never had to answer before, because no human being in the entire history of our species has ever faced it. The explorers who crossed unknown oceans, who trekked across unmapped continents, who climbed where no one had climbed before, they were always going somewhere that was, at least in principle, connected to the world they came from. They always had, even in the most remote places, the sky above them that arched over everything, the stars that sailors used to find their way home, the ground beneath their feet that was made of the same earth they had always known. Mars is a different kind of departure. It is not exploration in the traditional sense. It is, in the most profound meaning of the word, exile, and whether human beings are psychologically capable of choosing that exile and surviving it with their minds and their sense of self intact is a question that no amount of engineering can answer for us. We are stardust, yes. We are the universe becoming aware of itself, asking questions about where it came from and what it is. That is beautiful beyond measure. But we are also animals, earth animals, shaped by 4 billion years of this specific world. And taking us permanently away from that world asks something of us that we don't yet fully understand how to give. Now, we've spent 4 parts of this story inside the human experience of Mars, the body, the mind, the psychology, and all of it has been set against the backdrop of a planet that is hostile in ways both obvious and subtle. But there's a dimension of the Mars challenge we haven't addressed at all yet, and it might be the most practically daunting of everything we've covered. Not the atmosphere, not the radiation, not the human psychology. The sheer logistics of keeping people alive on Mars, day after day, using resources that either have to be carried from Earth across hundreds of millions of kilometers of space, or extracted and manufactured on site from a planet that offers those resources in forms that are difficult, energy-intensive, and technically complex to access. How do you feed a colony on Mars? How do you supply it? How do you replace what breaks? How do you build anything? How do you sustain a civilization, even a tiny one, on a world that has never supported life as far as we know, using technology that has to function perfectly, continuously, indefinitely, with no supply chain safety net anywhere in the solar system? Let's talk about supply chains, because everything we've discussed so far, the radiation shielding, the heated habitats, the oxygen generation systems, the medical equipment, the food production infrastructure, the psychological support tools, the spacesuits, the rovers, the power systems, all of it has to come from somewhere. All of it has to be built, maintained, repaired, and eventually replaced. And on Mars, the logistics of doing that are so staggeringly complex that they represent, in the view of many aerospace engineers and mission planners, the single greatest practical obstacle to any kind of long-term human presence on the planet. Let's start with the most fundamental question of all. How do you feed people on Mars? A single human being requires roughly 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day to maintain basic function under resting conditions. Add the physical demands of maintaining a Martian habitat, construction, equipment maintenance, suit operations, the constant physical work that survival in an engineered environment requires, and that number climbs. Now multiply it by a crew of, say, 6 people on an initial mission. That's somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 calories per day, every day, for the duration of the mission. NASA has estimated that a Mars mission with a crew of 6 would require approximately 4.8 kilograms of food per person per day. When you account for packaging, preparation materials, and the logistical overhead of food systems, that's roughly 29 kilograms per day for a 6-person crew over a 500-day surface mission. And remember, the planetary alignment window means you can't just leave whenever you want. That's approximately 14,500 kilograms of food. Nearly 15 metric tons, just for food, just for 6 people. Now consider what it costs to launch mass off the surface of Earth and send it to Mars. Current estimates for delivering payload to the Martian surface using the most optimistic projections for next-generation launch systems, including SpaceX's Starship, which is designed with Mars in mind, hover somewhere around $2,000 to $10,000 per kilogram, depending on the mission architecture and the assumptions you're willing to make. Even at the most optimistic end of that range, 15 metric tons of food represents a cost on the order of $30 million, and that's before you've paid for anything else, before the habitat, before the life support systems, before the power generation equipment, before the medical supplies, before the spacesuits, before the rovers, before the communication systems, before the propellant for the return journey. The mass problem is the foundational constraint of Mars colonization, and every proposed solution to it loops back to the same core challenge. You have to produce as much as possible on Mars itself, using local resources, because the cost of shipping things from Earth is so prohibitive that any settlement dependent primarily on Earth resupply is not a colony. It's an extraordinarily expensive campsite with a very long and fragile supply line. This is where in situ resource utilization, the idea of living off the land on Mars, using what the planet itself provides, becomes not just an interesting engineering concept, but an absolute survival necessity. And when you dig into what in situ resource utilization on Mars actually involves, the scale of the challenge becomes clear. Water is the starting point, because water is everything. It's drinking water. It's the raw material for oxygen generation. It's the feedstock for rocket propellant production. Split water into hydrogen and oxygen using electrolysis, and you have the components of one of the most powerful chemical rocket fuels known. It's the medium in which hydroponic food production happens. It's the basis of almost every biological and chemical process a human settlement requires. Find water on Mars, extract it reliably, and you've solved a significant portion of the resource puzzle. And Mars does have water. We know this with confidence. The Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, the CRISM spectrometer aboard it, and a constellation of subsequent missions have mapped extensive water ice deposits in the polar regions and at mid-latitudes beneath the surface. The SHARAD and MARSIS ground-penetrating radar instruments have detected what appears to be subsurface ice and possibly liquid water, a controversial finding announced in 2018 based on MARSIS data suggesting a liquid water lake beneath the South Polar ice cap, though subsequent analyses have debated its interpretation. Phoenix confirmed water ice directly by digging into the surface at its landing site in the northern polar region in 2008. Curiosity has detected hydrated minerals in Gale Crater. The water is there, but water exists on Mars and water is accessible to a surface settlement are two very different statements. The most concentrated ice deposits are at the poles, which are also the coldest, darkest, most radiation exposed, and logistically most challenging places to build a habitat. Mid-latitude subsurface ice is more promising in terms of location, but extracting it requires drilling through Martian regolith, that perchlorate-laden, abrasive, mechanically difficult material we discussed earlier, using equipment that has to be brought from Earth or manufactured on-site, powered by an energy source that has to be maintained continuously, processed through systems that have to function without significant failure. Every step in the resource extraction chain has this quality, every single one. It sounds straightforward in a mission architecture document. Drill for ice, melt it, electrolyze it, pipe the oxygen to the habitat. But each of those steps involves hardware that can and does fail, operating in an environment that accelerates failure through temperature cycling, dust infiltration, radiation damage to electronics, and the physical abrasiveness of Martian regolith on moving mechanical parts. Redundancy, having backup systems for every critical component, adds mass, which adds cost, which increases the difficulty of getting everything there in the first place. And then there's energy. Everything on Mars requires energy. Heating the habitat requires energy. Running the oxygen generation system requires energy. Extracting and processing water requires energy. Growing food under artificial lighting, because Martian sunlight at the surface, even when not blocked by a dust storm, delivers only about 43% of the solar intensity available at Earth's surface, due to Mars's greater distance from the Sun, requires energy. Charging the suits requires energy. Running the communications systems requires energy. Keeping the electronics warm enough to function during the Martian night requires energy. Processing rocket propellant for the return journey requires enormous energy. The numbers on propellant production alone are sobering. One of the most widely discussed Mars mission architectures, the one that forms the basis of SpaceX's planning, involves producing methane and liquid oxygen on Mars using the Sabatier reaction. Combining carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere with hydrogen to produce methane and water, the methane becomes rocket fuel. The water gets electrolyzed for oxygen. The system is chemically elegant and physically achievable. But producing enough propellant to launch a vehicle off Mars and send it back toward Earth requires generating hundreds of metric tons of methane and liquid oxygen. The energy required to do that, using whatever power systems you've managed to establish on Mars, is enormous, on the order of megawatts sustained over months. That's a nuclear power plant's worth of energy generation, operating continuously in an environment that is actively hostile to mechanical systems. The kilopower nuclear fission reactor that NASA has been developing a compact system based on a uranium-235 fission core and Stirling engines, is designed to produce about 10 kilowatts of electrical power per unit. 10 kilowatts is a start. It could power basic life support for a small crew, producing the energy needed for full propellant generation, food production, water extraction, habitat heating, and all other systems simultaneously would require either many such units operating in parallel or a significantly larger reactor. The engineering is feasible in principle. The logistics of getting that equipment to Mars, installing it, and maintaining it across years of continuous operation are a different matter. And here's the compounding problem that mission planners refer to as the tyranny of the rocket equation, a real phrase used by real aerospace engineers with a kind of weary affection. Every kilogram of equipment you need to bring to Mars requires propellant to accelerate it during launch, more propellant to decelerate it during the journey, more propellant for Mars orbit insertion, and more for descent to the surface. And every kilogram of propellant you add to carry that equipment also needs propellant to carry it. The mass requirements don't add, they multiply. The more you need to get what you need there, in a compounding cycle that makes large payloads extraordinarily expensive to deliver. This is why the in situ resource utilization question is so central. Because every kilogram you don't have to bring from Earth breaks one link in that compounding chain. But achieving meaningful in situ production requires sending sophisticated manufacturing equipment ahead of any crewed mission, equipment that has to land safely, deploy autonomously, and operate reliably for years before humans ever arrive. Every one of those requirements is a significant technical challenge on its own. Together, they represent a level of robotic autonomous operation that is substantially beyond anything we've demonstrated in space to date, though missions like Perseverance are building toward it. Now let's talk about what happens when things break, because on Mars, things will break. This is not pessimism, it is the basic statistical reality of complex mechanical and electronic systems operating under continuous stress in a harsh environment over extended timescales. Mean time between failures is a real engineering metric, and no system has an infinite one. On the International Space Station, the near-constant need for repairs and maintenance is one of the defining features of life aboard. Astronauts spend a significant portion of their time fixing things, replacing components, troubleshooting systems, performing extravehicular activities to repair external hardware. The ISS can be resupplied relatively quickly. A Soyuz or a commercial cargo vehicle can reach it in as little as 6 hours from launch. Spare parts can be sent up within days or weeks of a failure being identified. The support infrastructure of Earth is, in orbital terms, just down the road. Mars is not down the road. The minimum one-way transit time for a cargo mission is 6 to 9 months, and that only works during the favorable launch window that occurs roughly every 26 months. If a critical system fails on Mars outside of a launch window, or if the failure is severe enough that waiting 6 to 9 months for a resupply ship is not compatible with survival, the crew is on their own. They have whatever spares they brought, whatever they can improvise, whatever that they can manufacture from local materials using tools and techniques they either carried with them or can fabricate on site. This places extraordinary demands on crew competence. Every member of a Mars crew would need to be, to an unprecedented degree, a generalist of generalists, capable of performing emergency surgery, diagnosing and repairing complex electronic systems, maintaining life support hardware, managing agricultural production, operating geological survey equipment, and handling the psychological demands of leadership and conflict resolution, all simultaneously under conditions of chronic stress and fatigue. The Renaissance ideal of the universal person, equally capable in every domain, is, to put it mildly, a difficult standard to achieve in practice. And yet the logistics of Mars demand something approaching it. Three-dimensional printing and additive manufacturing have been proposed as partial solutions to the spare parts problem, the ability to fabricate replacement components on-site from raw materials rather than waiting for resupply. And this is a genuine and promising area of development. NASA has been exploring in-space manufacturing capabilities for years, and the concept of using Martian regolith as a raw material for printing structural components is actively being researched. But the range of components that can currently be fabricated this way is limited. You cannot three-dimensionally print a microprocessor. You cannot print the specific polymer seals that keep a spacesuit pressurized. You cannot print precision optical components or the rare earth elements needed in certain electronics. The manufacturing ecosystem required to produce even a fraction of the components a Martian settlement would need entirely on site would itself be an industrial infrastructure of extraordinary complexity. And underlying all of this, the food production, the water extraction, the energy generation, the manufacturing, the repairs, is a single stark truth that every Mars colonization plan has to eventually reckon with. A small isolated settlement on Mars would be, for at least the first decades of its existence, entirely dependent on Earth for its survival at a level that no terrestrial civilization has ever experienced. Even the most remote human communities in history, Antarctic stations, island settlements, isolated mountain villages, existed within a biosphere that provided air, water, food, and the basic conditions for biological life as a free natural resource. They were isolated from other people, but not from the planet that made them possible. A Martian settlement would be isolated from everything. Isolated from Earth's supply chain by 6 to 9 months of transit time. Isolated from the natural resources that make biological life possible by an environment that provides none of them in accessible form. Isolated from the kind of industrial infrastructure needed to manufacture complex components by the sheer impossibility of replicating Earth's entire technological civilization in miniature on another planet. This is not an argument that it can't eventually be done. History is full of things that seemed impossibly complex until they weren't. But it is an argument for honesty about what stage of development human interplanetary civilization is actually at, and what the difference is between an inspiring long-term vision and a near-term operational reality. Because there's a conversation that tends to happen in the public space around Mars colonization, where the inspiring long-term vision and the near-term operational reality get blurred together in ways that do a disservice to both. The vision is real and worth pursuing. The reality is that we are right now still in the very early stages of developing even a fraction of the capabilities that vision requires. And the people who would be sent to Mars in any near-future mission would be living and potentially dying inside that gap between vision and reality. We've now walked through 5 layers of what makes Mars genuinely hostile to human existence. The environment that would kill you instantly without protection, the radiation silently damaging you from the inside, the soil laced with chemistry that poisons and complicates everything, the body breaking down in ways the planet accelerates, the mind straining under conditions it was never built for, and the logistics of survival that demand the near impossible from both the technology and the people operating it. But there's something we haven't discussed yet, something that sits above all of these individual challenges and connects them in a way that reframes the entire Mars conversation. It's about the timeline. About how far we actually are from solving these problems to the standard required, and about what the history of ambitious, complex, dangerous human endeavors, from the Apollo program to the development of commercial aviation, to the construction of the ISS, actually teaches us about the gap between announcement and achievement, between ambition and execution, because the history is instructive. And sometimes it is humbling in ways that the announcement culture of the space industry rarely pauses to acknowledge. Let's explore that now. And it involves some of the most important context for understanding where humanity actually stands in its relationship with Mars right now. Let's talk about time, specifically. Let's talk about the gap between when we say we're going to do something extraordinary and when we actually do it. Because that gap in the history of human spaceflight has a pattern, and that pattern matters enormously for understanding where we actually stand with Mars right now. Not where the press releases say we stand, not where the optimistic timelines say we'll be in 5 or 10 years, but where the honest, evidence-based picture puts us. In July of 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. 12 human beings total walked on the lunar surface before the Apollo program ended in December of 1972. It was one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of our species, a genuine, undeniable demonstration of what human beings are capable of when they commit resources, talent, and political will to a goal at a scale almost unprecedented in peacetime. And then we stopped. For reasons that were fundamentally political and economic rather than technical, humanity walked away from lunar exploration for over 50 years. The last human to stand on the moon, Gene Cernan, stepped back into the lunar module on December 14, 1972, and no human being has been back since. More than half a century later, as of the time this video was made, the moon, just 384,000 kilometers away, reachable in 3 days, remains unvisited by human beings since the Nixon administration. That is the first thing the history of spaceflight teaches us. Ambition and capability are not the same thing as sustained commitment. And without sustained commitment, without the political will, the consistent funding, the institutional continuity to see a decades-long program through its inevitable setbacks and cost overruns and failures, even proven capability atrophies, NASA's budget peaked during the Apollo era at roughly 4.4% of the total US federal budget in 1966. Today it sits at roughly half of 1%. The agency has accomplished extraordinary things within that constraint. Robotic exploration that has transformed our understanding of the solar system, the Hubble Space Telescope and its successors, the International Space Station, a fleet of Mars rovers that have rewritten planetary science. But sustained human deep space exploration requires resources at a scale that modern NASA budgets simply don't provide. Now, the counter-argument that always comes at this point in the conversation is SpaceX. Elon Musk has publicly stated his intention to send humans to Mars, has built hardware explicitly designed with that goal in mind, and has achieved things with Starship, the massive fully reusable launch system central to his Mars architecture that would have seemed fantastical just a decade ago. Starship conducted its first integrated flight test in April of 2023, and subsequent test flights have demonstrated progressive improvements in the vehicle's performance and recovery capabilities, including the remarkable achievement of catching the booster with the launch tower's mechanical arms. This is genuinely impressive. The pace of development at SpaceX has repeatedly surprised people who expected it to be slower. And the ambition is real. Musk has spoken about a self-sustaining city on Mars, with a population of 1 million people as the long-term goal, framing it explicitly as a survival insurance policy for human civilization in the event of a catastrophic event on Earth. But here's where the historical pattern becomes relevant again. Musk's first public timeline for sending humans to Mars was around 2018. Then it moved to the early 20s, then the mid-20s, then the late 20s. Each revision pushed the date further out as the engineering reality of what the mission actually requires became clearer. This isn't a criticism unique to SpaceX. It is the universal experience of every major aerospace program in history. The Apollo program took nearly a decade from Kennedy's announcement to the moon landing, and it had essentially unlimited political and financial support. The Space Launch System, NASA's own heavy-lift rocket designed in part for lunar and eventually Mars missions, was announced in 2011 with a first launch target of 2017. It finally launched for the first time in November of 2022, 5 years late. The James Webb Space Telescope, NASA's flagship astronomical observatory, was originally planned for a 2007 launch. It finally reached space in December of 2021, 14 years behind its original schedule and roughly 10 times over its initial budget estimate. These are not failures. They are examples of how incredibly hard it is to do genuinely new things in space. The James Webb Space Telescope is a triumph, a scientific instrument of breathtaking capability that is revolutionizing astronomy. But it is also a reminder that when human beings attempt things at the absolute frontier of what is technically possible, the timelines we generate at the beginning of the process are almost always optimistic to a degree that ranges from significant to dramatic. A crewed Mars mission is not at the frontier of what is technically possible. It is beyond the frontier of what is technically possible with currently operational hardware. It requires advances not just in rocket propulsion, where genuine progress is being made, but in radiation protection for long-duration deep space transit, in closed-loop life support systems capable of sustained operation with minimal resupply, in in-situ resource utilization at operational scale, in autonomous medical capabilities, in long-duration human factors management, and in the propellant production infrastructure needed to get people home. Each of these areas is the subject of active research and development. None of them are solved. The radiation problem alone, the fact that a transit to Mars and back delivers a radiation dose that pushes against or exceeds current career limits for astronauts using any shielding architecture that is practically launchable with existing or near-future rockets, does not have an engineering solution ready for operational deployment. The mass of shielding required to meaningfully reduce galactic cosmic ray exposure during a 9-month transit is prohibitive with chemical propulsion. Nuclear thermal propulsion, which could cut transit times roughly in half, reducing radiation exposure accordingly, has been studied since the 1960s, tested in ground-based programs like NERVA in the late 1960s and early 70s, and repeatedly proposed and shelved. NASA's current space nuclear propulsion program is working toward it again, but a flight-ready nuclear thermal propulsion system capable of carrying a crewed Mars mission does not exist today, and realistic development timelines put it at least a decade away under optimistic funding assumptions, and this is the landscape we're actually in. Not the landscape of press releases and ambitious announcements, but the landscape of engineering reality, of budget constraints, of the painstaking, decade-spanning work required to develop the capabilities a Mars mission actually needs. Why does this matter? Why spend time on timelines and funding realities in a video about the challenges of Mars? Because the gap between the public perception of where we are and the technical reality of where we are has real consequences. It shapes how society allocates attention and resources. It shapes what people believe is imminent versus what is genuinely decades away. And most importantly, it shapes the conversation about what level of preparation and problem-solving we actually need before we send human beings into an environment that is, as we've now spent considerable time establishing, capable of killing them in more ways than almost any environment our species has ever attempted to inhabit. There is a version of the Mars enthusiasm that is genuinely wonderful, the version that looks at the horizon and sees human potential extending out into the cosmos, that understands exploration as a core expression of what we are as a species, that recognizes the scientific value of crewed Mars missions in ways that robotic exploration, extraordinary as it is, cannot fully replicate. That version of Mars enthusiasm is worth celebrating and sustaining. It is part of what makes us human. The impulse to go further, to see what's over the next ridge, to ask what's out there. That impulse has carried us from the African savanna to every corner of this planet and ultimately to the moon. It is not something to be talked out of. But there is another version of the Mars enthusiasm, the version that treats the challenges as essentially solved. That frames serious obstacles as mere engineering details to be handled, that conflates vision with readiness, that presents a 1 million person Martian city as a near-future certainty rather than a multi-generational aspiration requiring sustained civilizational commitment. And that version does a disservice to the science, to the engineering, and most importantly to the human beings who would eventually attempt the journey, the people who go to Mars. Whenever that happens, whether it's the late 2030s or the 2040s or beyond, deserve to go on the back of our most honest assessment of the risks, our most complete development of the countermeasures, and our most rigorous testing of every system they'll depend on for their survival. They deserve not to be rushed by competitive pressure or marketing cycles, or the impatience of a public whose attention span operates on timescales that have nothing to do with the timescales of safe deep space mission development. Carl Sagan, who understood the cosmos as deeply as almost anyone who ever lived, wrote in his book Pale Blue Dot, published in 1994, the year after the famous photograph of Earth taken by Voyager 1 from beyond the orbit of Neptune, inspired its title, that Mars beckons us as a world where the human future might one day be written. He believed in Mars exploration with a conviction rooted in both scientific passion and a clear-eyed understanding of humanity's need to extend beyond a single fragile world. But he also wrote with consistent honesty about the difficulty, about the genuine hostility of space, about the responsibility that comes with sending human beings into danger. Sagan understood that the universe doesn't grade on a curve. It doesn't reward ambition with survival. It rewards preparation. And preparation, in the context of Mars, means facing every uncomfortable truth about what it will take. The biological challenges, the psychological challenges, the engineering challenges, the logistical challenges, and yes, the timeline challenges, with the same rigor and honesty that we apply to the inspiring parts of the story, because the inspiring parts are real, genuinely, profoundly real. The Mars we've been describing throughout this video, cold, toxic, irradiated, airless, a world of perchlorates and dust storms and bone-crushing loneliness, is the same Mars that carries within its ancient geology a record of a solar system billions of years in the making. It's the same Mars where, in Jezero crater, the Perseverance rover is collecting rock samples from what was once a river delta, samples that might contain biosignatures, chemical traces of microbial life, that could rewrite everything we think we know about the distribution of life in the universe. It's the same Mars whose massive shield volcanoes and canyon systems speak to geological forces operating on scales that dwarf anything Earth has produced. It's the same Mars that, on clear nights, appears as a steady rust-colored point of light in our sky, close enough to resolve into a disk through even a modest backyard telescope, close enough that the signals from our robots reach it in minutes. Mars is not just a problem to be solved. It is a world, ancient, complex, brutal, and in its own way magnificent. And the story of humanity's relationship with Mars is not finished. It is, in the deepest sense, just beginning. But beginnings matter. How you start a journey, How honestly you assess what it requires, how thoroughly you prepare for what it will demand, shapes everything that follows. The history of exploration is full of expeditions that failed not because the goal was unreachable, but because the preparation was insufficient. Robert Falcon Scott reached the South Pole in January of 1912, only to find that Roald Amundsen had beaten him there by 33 days. Scott and his 4 companions died on the return journey, not because the Antarctic was inherently unsurvivable, but because a combination of planning decisions, equipment limitations, and logistical miscalculations left them without the margin they needed when conditions turned against them. Mars will not forgive insufficient margins. Mars does not do second chances. And that is not a reason to be afraid of the dream. It is a reason to take the dream seriously enough to do it right. We've covered the environment, the biology, the psychology, the logistics, and the timeline. But there is one final layer of complexity in the Mars conversation that almost never gets discussed in the mainstream, and it's a question that doesn't come from engineering or medicine or psychology. It comes from philosophy and ethics, and from a branch of planetary science called planetary protection. What do we owe Mars? What are our responsibilities toward a world we're planning to visit and potentially permanently alter? And what happens if the most exciting scientific hypothesis about Mars turns out to be true? The answer changes the entire moral architecture of the conversation. If you are still with me, you already see the universe differently than most people do. Make sure to subscribe and hit like. Every video we go somewhere extraordinary together and bring back something that changes how you see everything. Let's ask a question that most Mars colonization conversations skip entirely. What if Mars is not dead? Not dead in the way a rock is dead, not sterile in the absolute, unqualified sense that the word implies when people use it casually. What if Mars, beneath its frozen, irradiated, perchlorate-dusted surface, harbors something alive, something small, something microbial, something clinging to existence in the last refuges where liquid water and chemical energy still permit biology to operate, deep in subsurface aquifers, in geothermally warmed pockets of rock, in the thin films of brine that some models suggest could exist just below the surface in certain locations during certain seasons. This is not science fiction. It is a live scientific hypothesis taken seriously by serious researchers, supported by a growing body of indirect evidence, and carrying implications that would fundamentally alter not just the scientific value of Mars, but the entire ethical framework around sending humans there. Let's start with what we know. Mars today is, at its surface, extraordinarily hostile to life as we understand it. The radiation, the perchlorates, the near vacuum, the extreme cold, all of these make the surface essentially uninhabitable for any biology remotely resembling what we know from Earth. But life on Earth has repeatedly demonstrated a capacity for surviving in conditions that seem, by any reasonable prior expectation, completely incompatible with biology. Extremophiles, organisms that thrive in environments once considered too harsh for life, have been found in the superheated water of deep-sea hydrothermal vents, in the hypersaline waters of the Dead Sea, in the acid rivers flowing from volcanic systems with a pH approaching 0, in the permanently frozen soils of Antarctic permafrost, in the intensely irradiated cooling ponds of nuclear reactors, in rocks kilometers beneath Earth's surface where sunlight has never reached, and temperatures and pressures would destroy most organisms instantly. The more we look, the more we find life in places we didn't expect it, and every time we extend the known boundaries of the biosphere, the question of whether similar life might exist on Mars, or once existed, or exists still in some diminished, retreated form, becomes more rather than less plausible. Mars was not always the world it is today. 4 billion years ago, it had a thicker atmosphere, a magnetic field, and liquid water flowing across its surface in quantities large enough to carve the enormous valley systems and outflow channels visible in orbital imagery today. The timing of that early, warmer, wetter Mars overlaps with the period on Earth during which life first emerged, suggesting that if the chemistry was right and the conditions were sufficient, Mars had as much opportunity for abiogenesis, for the emergence of life from chemistry, as early Earth did. What happened to that life if it existed? The most scientifically interesting possibility, not the most probable, but the most consequential if true, is that it didn't entirely disappear, that as Mars lost its atmosphere and its surface became hostile, life retreated, moved underground, followed the liquid water downward, deeper into the crust, into the hydrothermal systems around any remaining geological heat sources, into the subsurface brines that Mars's chemistry might support even today. The 2018 announcement from the Martian radar team suggesting the possible detection of a liquid water lake beneath the South Polar ice cap at a depth of about 1.5 kilometers caused enormous excitement precisely because it pointed toward exactly this kind of refuge. Subsequent analysis has muddied the picture. Some researchers have proposed that the radar signature could be explained by other geological materials rather than liquid water, but the possibility has not been ruled out. And even if that particular location doesn't hold liquid water, the broader question of subsurface liquid environments on Mars remains open and scientifically active. If Mars harbors life, even microbial life, even life that bears no resemblance to anything in our biosphere beyond the basic chemistry of carbon and water, the discovery would be arguably the most significant scientific finding in human history. It would tell us that life is not a fluke, not a one-time accident on one lucky world, but a phenomenon that emerges wherever conditions permit. It would transform our understanding of the distribution of life in the universe. It would rewrite the Drake equation. It would answer, in the most direct possible way, the question that has haunted human beings since we first looked up at the stars and wondered whether we were alone. And here is where the ethical complexity enters. Because sending humans to Mars, hundreds of them, eventually thousands in the colonization vision, means sending with them the entire biological baggage of Earth. Every person carries roughly 37 trillion human cells and approximately the same number of microbial cells, bacteria, archaea, viruses, fungi, most of which are deeply integrated with human physiology and cannot be separated from it. A human being in a sealed spacesuit is not a sterile object. A habitat built on Mars will inevitably leak biological material into the Martian environment. Dust-carrying human skin cells, exhaled metabolites, shed microorganisms. The biological signature of human presence is not something that can be perfectly contained. If Martian life exists, and we contaminate Mars with Earth life before we've had the chance to find and study it, we face several catastrophic scenarios. Earth microorganisms, which have been shaped by billions of years of competitive evolution in a rich, complex biosphere, might outcompete any native Martian biology in the niches where Martian life survives. We might drive the only other life in the known universe to extinction before we even knew it was there. Alternatively, and this scenario cuts the other way, Martian microorganisms, if they exist, could hitch a ride back to Earth aboard returning spacecraft or astronauts, entering a biosphere that has no immune history with them and no evolved defenses. The consequences of that are, to put it mildly, unknowable. This is not a hypothetical concern invented by overcautious bureaucrats. It is the entire foundation of planetary protection, a field of space law and policy, governed by the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 and implemented by international guidelines developed through the Committee on Space Research, known as COSPAR. The principle is straightforward. We have a scientific and ethical obligation to avoid contaminating other worlds with Earth biology before we've had the chance to study them, and to avoid contaminating Earth with extraterrestrial biology before we understand what we're dealing with. Robotic missions to Mars are subject to rigorous sterilization protocols. The Perseverance rover, before launch, underwent extensive cleaning designed to reduce its biological burden to the lowest practically achievable level, though lowest practically achievable is emphatically not zero. Even our best robotic missions carry some Earth microorganisms, particularly hardy spore-forming bacteria that can survive the sterilization processes we use. It's one of the more uncomfortable truths in planetary science. Crude missions raise this problem by orders of magnitude. You cannot sterilize a human being. You cannot remove the biological ecosystem that is inseparable from human life and still send a living person. Every plan for crude Mars exploration carries within it an inherent tension between the human need to be present and the scientific imperative to preserve Mars's biological pristineness. To the extent it has any, long enough to determine whether life exists there before we inadvertently destroy the evidence or, worse, the life itself. Some researchers and mission planners have argued that this concern is overstated, that Mars is so hostile at the surface that Earth microorganisms couldn't survive there anyway, that the real Martian environments where life might exist are so deep underground that surface contamination would take millennia to reach them, that the scientific value of human exploration outweighs the contamination risk. These are legitimate positions in a genuine scientific debate. Others argue that the possibility of native Martian life, even a small probability, demands we proceed with extraordinary caution, that the asymmetry of consequences is enormous. If we contaminate Mars and there was life there, we lose something irreplaceable and irreversible. The precautionary principle in this context has profound weight, and underneath all of this is a deeper philosophical question that doesn't get asked nearly enough. What rights, if any, does a living world have? Not in the legal sense, no court has jurisdiction over Mars, but in the ethical sense. If Mars harbors life, does that life have a claim to its own existence that we are obligated to respect? Does the potential presence of another biology in the universe place constraints on what we are entitled to do to the world that biology inhabits? These are not comfortable questions, they don't have easy answers, and they sit in direct tension with some of the most compelling arguments for Mars colonization, particularly the argument that establishing a multiplanetary civilization is a survival imperative for our species, an insurance policy against the extinction of all human life and all human knowledge in a single planetary catastrophe. That argument is real and serious. The philosopher and cognitive scientist Nick Bostrom has written extensively on existential risk, the category of risks that could permanently and catastrophically curtail humanity's potential. A large asteroid impact, a supervolcanic eruption, a runaway pandemic, a civilization-ending conflict. These are low probability but non-zero possibilities that over long enough timescales represent genuine threats to the continuity of human civilization on a single world. The case for becoming a multiplanetary species as a hedge against these risks is philosophically and practically coherent. But coherent doesn't mean simple. The insurance policy argument for Mars assumes that the value of preserving human civilization outweighs whatever other values might be at stake, including the preservation of any other life that Mars might harbor. That is an assumption worth examining rather than simply accepting. We are, after all, a species with a long and complicated history of arriving in places we found useful and treating whatever was already there as secondary to our own needs. The history of exploration on Earth offers both inspiring and cautionary chapters on exactly this dynamic. The courage of the explorers who crossed oceans and mapped unknown continents is real and admirable. The consequences for the peoples and ecosystems they encountered are also real and considerably more complicated. Mars forces us to confront this dynamic in its most distilled form, stripped of the political and social complexities that make the analogous questions on Earth so contentious, reduced to a near-pure confrontation between human survival interest and the moral weight of life in its most fundamental form, and even setting aside the question of native Martian life entirely, there is the question of what we do to Mars's geology, its chemistry, its ancient record of planetary history, once large numbers of humans begin operating there. Mars carries within its rocks a 4.5 billion-year archive of the inner solar system's history. Its geology preserves evidence of conditions that Earth's active plate tectonics and hydrological cycle have long since erased from our own rock record. Its polar ice cores contain a chronological record of Martian climate stretching back hundreds of millions of years. This is a scientific treasure of extraordinary value, and it is fragile in the way that all archives are fragile. Once disturbed, the record cannot be restored. Industrial-scale colonization of Mars would, inevitably, involve significant modification of the Martian environment. Drilling, mining, construction, atmospheric processing, all of the activities that a self-sustaining colony would require would leave marks on a world whose unaltered state has irreplaceable scientific value. Some visionaries go further and advocate for terraforming, the deliberate, long-term alteration of Mars's atmosphere, temperature, and surface conditions to make the planet broadly habitable for Earth life without full life support infrastructure. The timescales involved in any realistic terraforming scenario are measured in centuries or millennia. The technical challenges are beyond anything currently conceivable, and the ethical questions it raises are staggering. The permanent, irreversible transformation of an entire world with consequences we cannot fully predict, driven by human ambition operating on a planetary scale. There is something both magnificent and vertiginous about the fact that we are a species now seriously contemplating this. That the descendants of single-celled organisms that emerged in shallow seas on a small rocky planet roughly 3.8 billion years ago have arrived, in what is cosmically a blink, at the point of asking whether and how they should alter other worlds to suit themselves. The universe doesn't hand out many stories as strange and as audacious as ours, but audacity without wisdom has a poor track record. And wisdom in this context means sitting with the uncomfortable questions about what Mars might be, about what we might destroy in going there, about what we owe to life that is not us, and worlds that did not invite us, rather than rushing past them toward the parts of the story that feel unambiguously good. Because here's what ties all of these threads together: the environmental hostility, the biological fragility, the psychological burden, the logistical enormity, the timeline humility, and the ethical complexity. They are all expressions of a single underlying truth about where humanity stands right now in its relationship with the cosmos. We are at the very beginning, not the middle, not the late stages of preparation, the very beginning of the long, difficult, extraordinary process of becoming a species that can survive and flourish beyond the world that made us. And the beginning of any genuinely difficult journey is precisely the moment when honesty matters most, when the gap between aspiration and capability needs to be named clearly, not to discourage the journey, but to ensure that when we take those first steps, we take them with our eyes open, our preparations complete, and our values intact. Mars will still be there. It has been orbiting the Sun for 4.5 billion years. It is not going anywhere. And the human story, the story of stardust becoming curious, becoming capable, becoming brave enough to reach for other worlds, that story is not going anywhere either. But the next chapter of that story, The chapter that involves human feet on Martian soil needs to be written carefully, because the chapters you rush are the ones you regret. We're now 7 parts into this story, and we've covered an extraordinary amount of ground. But there's still a crucial piece we haven't touched, something that, in many ways, is the most practically urgent question in the entire Mars conversation right now. Not the distant challenges of colonization, but the immediate challenge of the journey itself, the transit, the 6 to 9 months of deep space travel between Earth and Mars, outside the protection of Earth's magnetosphere, in a spacecraft before anyone sets foot on the Martian surface, because the journey to Mars might be more dangerous than Mars itself. And the specific combination of factors that make deep space transit so threatening to the human body is something we've only begun to fully understand in the last decade of research. Let's go back to space itself, not Mars, not Earth, the vast, cold, silent gulf between them, the part of the journey that appears in mission architectures as a simple arrow connecting 2 dots on a diagram, 6 to 9 months, propulsion phase, transit complete. A clean graphic that in no way communicates what those 6 to 9 months would actually be like for the human beings living through them inside a metal cylinder, roughly the size of a large recreational vehicle, traveling at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour through an environment that is, in almost every measurable way, inimical to biological life. We touched on radiation in part 1. But we talked about it primarily in the context of Mars's surface, the missing magnetosphere, the unshielded regolith, the solar particle events. What happens during the transit itself is a different conversation, and in some ways a more immediately pressing one, because the transit is closer in both the literal and the developmental sense than the surface challenges. Before we ever have to solve perchlorate agriculture or underground habitat construction, we have to solve getting there without arriving irreparably damaged. And the honest answer, right now, is that we don't fully know how to do that yet. Here's the physics of the problem. Earth's magnetosphere extends roughly 63,000 kilometers above the planet's surface on the sunward side, a vast protective bubble that deflects the majority of charged particles streaming from the Sun and from deep space. The International Space Station orbits at roughly 400 kilometers altitude, well within this protective bubble. Every human being who has ever lived in space, with the exception of the 24 Apollo astronauts who traveled to the Moon and back, has done so entirely within Earth's magnetosphere. We have almost no direct human physiological data from extended deep space exposure because almost no human being has ever been in deep space for more than a few days. The Apollo missions give us a partial picture. The longest Apollo mission, Apollo 17, spent 12 days in space, of which roughly 3 days were in deep space beyond Earth's magnetosphere during the translunar and trans-Earth portions of the journey. 12 astronauts walked on the Moon, with the longest single surface stay being about 75 hours. That's an extraordinarily short exposure window compared to a 6 to 9 month Mars transit. The radiation doses received by Apollo astronauts, while higher than those received by astronauts in low Earth orbit, were not immediately dangerous given the short duration. But they do provide data points that have informed subsequent research, and some of that research has produced findings that are quietly unsettling. A study published in Scientific Reports in 2016 examined the mortality rates of Apollo astronauts compared to astronauts who only flew in low Earth orbit and to a control group of non-astronaut test pilots. The Apollo astronauts showed a cardiovascular disease mortality rate roughly 4 to 5 times higher than the other groups. The sample size is small, only 24 people flew to the Moon, so the statistical significance has been debated. but the biological mechanism proposed by the researchers is consistent with what laboratory work has independently established. Deep space radiation damages the vascular endothelium, the thin cellular lining of blood vessels, in ways that accelerate atherosclerosis, the buildup of plaque in arterial walls that drives heart disease and stroke. This is separate from the cancer risk we discussed earlier. This is a direct cardiovascular effect of deep space radiation, operating through a different biological pathway, potentially adding another layer of long-term health consequence to the radiation's exposure picture. It suggests that the health risks of deep space travel may be broader and more multi-system than even the already concerning cancer and neurological risk estimates indicate. Now let's talk about the specific nature of the radiation encountered during a deep space transit, because it is genuinely unlike anything most people think about when they imagine radiation exposure. There are two primary categories of deep space radiation that a Mars-bound crew would face. The first is solar energetic particles, bursts of high-energy protons and other charged particles ejected during solar flares and coronal mass ejections. These are dangerous but in some ways manageable. We can detect precursors to major solar energetic particle events with some warning time, and the shielding required to protect against them, while heavy, is not practically impossible. A small, heavily shielded storm shelter compartment within the spacecraft, where the crew retreats during a major solar event, is a standard feature of most crewed Mars mission designs. Water, which is both a consumable you're carrying anyway and an excellent radiation absorber due to its hydrogen content, can be arranged around the shelter walls to provide additional shielding. This approach works reasonably well for solar energetic particles. The second category is galactic cosmic rays, and galactic cosmic rays are an entirely different and far more difficult problem. Galactic cosmic rays are not produced by our Sun. They originate from cataclysmic events throughout the galaxy, supernova explosions, neutron star collisions, the violent environments around black holes, and they arrive at our solar system from all directions continuously with energies that dwarf anything produced by solar activity. The most energetic galactic cosmic rays carry more energy per particle than the most powerful particle accelerators on Earth can produce. They are predominantly high-charge, high-energy atomic nuclei, the stripped cores of atoms like iron, silicon, and magnesium, traveling at velocities approaching the speed of light. And here is what makes them so technically challenging to shield against. Their extraordinary energy means they can punch through almost any practical shielding material. Unlike solar energetic particles, which are stopped relatively efficiently by dense materials like water or polyethylene, galactic cosmic ray primaries pass straight through thin shielding. Worse, when they do interact with shielding material, they can produce secondary radiation through a process called spallation, fragmenting into a shower of secondary particles, some of which are actually more biologically damaging than the original particle. Adding shielding against galactic cosmic rays up to a certain thickness can actually increase the radiation dose received by the crew, because the spallation products accumulate faster than the primary particles are absorbed. Beyond a certain thickness, roughly 500 grams per square centimeter of shielding material, which translates to roughly 5 meters of water, the shielding starts to become net beneficial again. But 5 meters of water around an entire spacecraft is an absurd mass penalty that no launch system now in existence or under development could practically accommodate. The physics of this problem is well understood. The solution, however, is not. Current research directions include pharmaceutical countermeasures, drugs that might protect cells from radiation damage or accelerate their repair afterward, and the development of novel shielding materials with better properties than conventional options. NASA's Human Research Program has been exploring antioxidant compounds, DNA repair enhancers, and radioprotective agents. Some animal studies have shown promising results. None have been validated for humans in deep space conditions. The most effective engineering solution remains reducing transit time, spending fewer months in the radiation environment by traveling faster. This is where nuclear thermal propulsion re-enters the conversation. A nuclear thermal rocket uses a nuclear reactor to heat propellant to extremely high temperatures, expelling it to generate thrust with roughly twice the specific impulse of the best chemical rockets. Twice the specific impulse means roughly twice the fuel efficiency, which translates into the ability to carry more mass at the same fuel cost, or to travel faster for the same fuel expenditure. Optimistic estimates suggest nuclear thermal propulsion could reduce Earth-Mars transit time to perhaps 3 to 4 months, cutting the galactic cosmic ray exposure window roughly in half compared to a chemical propulsion mission. 3 to 4 months in deep space is meaningfully better than 6 to 9. It doesn't solve the problem. Galactic cosmic ray exposure over 3 months still accumulates to a significant lifetime dose, but it moves the needle in the right direction. And nuclear thermal propulsion has genuine scientific backing. The NERVA program, which ran in the United States from the mid-1950s through 1972, successfully tested nuclear thermal rocket engines on the ground and demonstrated the fundamental technical feasibility. The program was cancelled not for technical reasons, but for political and budgetary ones, as the broader context of the space program shifted after Apollo. Nuclear electric propulsion, using a nuclear reactor to generate electrical power that drives ion thrusters, offers even higher efficiency and could in principle achieve transit times shorter still, though the thrust levels are so low that the trajectory planning becomes complex. Concepts involving nuclear pulse propulsion, essentially detonating a series of small nuclear devices behind the spacecraft to propel it forward, are concepts studied under Project Orion in the late 1950s and early 1960s, could theoretically achieve transit times of weeks rather than months, but involve engineering and political challenges that place them firmly in the category of long-term speculation rather than near-future planning. The trajectory itself adds complexity worth understanding. Getting to Mars is not like driving from one city to another, where you point yourself at the destination and go. The most fuel-efficient path between Earth and Mars is called a Hohmann transfer orbit, a curved trajectory that follows an elliptical path through space, using the relative motions of the two planets to minimize propellant consumption. A Hohmann transfer to Mars takes roughly 9 months and only works when the planets are in the right relative positions, which occurs approximately every 26 months. Faster trajectories are possible, but require dramatically more propellant, following what are called high-energy transfer orbits. The trade-off between transit time and propellant mass is steep, which is why the transit time problem and the propellant production problem fundamentally linked. Solving one helps the other, and all of this assumes the spacecraft itself performs perfectly for the entire journey. A crewed Mars transit spacecraft is a life support environment that has to function without failure for months, in an environment where repair options are limited and rescue is non-existent. The engineering demands are comparable to the most demanding long-duration systems ever built, the life support systems of nuclear submarines, the environmental control systems of Antarctic research stations, but operating in conditions those systems were never designed for, subject to radiation damage to electronics and materials that has no terrestrial analog, and with no possibility of external intervention if something goes seriously wrong. The psychological experience of the transit deserves attention too, because it is qualitatively different from even the isolated Earth environments or the experience of the International Space Station. On the ISS, Earth fills a significant portion of the view, a living, cloud-swirled, unmistakably inhabited world just 400 kilometers below. The crew can see home. They know home is there. And the communication delay is essentially zero. Conversations with family, with mission control, with the entire web of human connection that grounds a person in their sense of self and their place in the world, happen in real time. In transit to Mars, Earth shrinks. In the first weeks, it's still recognizable, a bright blue point in the sky, unmistakably the world you came from, detailed enough through a camera lens to make out the swirl of weather systems. But as the weeks pass and the distance grows, it becomes just a point of light, indistinguishable from Venus, indistinguishable eventually from an ordinary star, the most psychologically significant object in any human being's experiential universe, the planet that bore them, that contains everything and everyone they have ever known, reduced to a pixel. And as Earth shrinks, Mars grows, slowly, imperceptibly at first, then with increasing clarity as the spacecraft closes the distance over months. A rust-colored disk that resolves into surface features, the Tharsis bulge, the polar caps, the vast dark scar of Valles Marineris stretching across the face of the planet, growing in the window, getting realer, the destination that was once an abstraction, a dot in an atlas, becoming a world. That psychological journey, the transition from a universe centered on Earth to a universe centered on Mars, has never been made by a human being. The Apollo astronauts experienced the beginning of it during their 3-day transits to the Moon, and their accounts of watching Earth recede are among the most moving documents in the literature of exploration. Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14 lunar module pilot, described experiencing a sudden, overwhelming sense of universal interconnectedness during the return journey, looking out at the star field, aware of the relationship between every atom in the universe, feeling what he called an instant global consciousness. He spent much of the rest of his life studying the neuroscience and philosophy of that experience. What 6 to 9 months of that journey would do to a person, the sustained contemplation of Earth as a distant point of light, the growing presence of Mars as the new center of experiential gravity, the isolation, the silence, the immensity of the space surrounding you in every direction, is genuinely unknown. No human psychology has ever been tested in those precise conditions. The closest analogues are the long-duration isolation studies and Antarctic winter rovers we've discussed. But none of them involve looking out a window at the place where every human being who has ever lived, every civilization that has ever risen and fallen, every piece of music and art and science that has ever been created is receding behind you into the dark. There is a concept in astronaut psychology called the overview effect, the cognitive and emotional shift that many astronauts report experiencing when they see Earth from space for the first time. A sudden, visceral understanding of the planet's fragility, its beauty, its wholeness, its isolation in the void. The borders and conflicts and distinctions that seem so absolute from the surface dissolve into the single blue sphere of a world that is, from outside, obviously one thing. Many astronauts have described it as transformative, a perspective shift that permanently altered how they understood human civilization and their place in it. The Mars transit might produce something analogous but different. Not the overview effect of seeing your world whole, but something we don't yet have a name for, the experience of watching your world become small, of feeling the gravity of your origin loosen its hold, not just physically but psychologically, and feeling the gravity of a new world begin to pull at something deeper than your body. The experience of genuinely leaving in a way that no human being has ever genuinely left before, Whether that experience would be transcendent or terrifying, illuminating or destabilizing, is probably different for different people. It might be both simultaneously. It might change over the course of the journey in ways that are hard to predict. It might be the most profound thing a human being has ever felt, or the most isolating, or both. What it would not be is ordinary. What it would not allow is indifference. 6 to 9 months in deep space between worlds would do something to a person, something significant, something irreversible, something we don't yet have the vocabulary to fully describe, because we haven't yet sent anyone to experience it, and that, in a way, is the heart of everything we've been building toward throughout this entire video. Mars is hard. Genuinely, profoundly, multidimensionally hard. The environment is hostile, the biology is complicated, the psychology is demanding, the logistics are staggering, the ethics are challenging, the transit is dangerous, the timeline is long. Every single layer of the Mars challenge, when you look at it honestly, is more complex and more difficult than the version that shows up in enthusiastic announcements and cinematic visions. And yet we keep looking at that rust-colored point of light in the sky and feeling something. Some pull that isn't entirely rational, that doesn't respond to lists of obstacles, that persists even when the numbers are sobering and the timelines are humbling. That pull is real. It is part of us. It is part of what we are. We are creatures who look at the horizon and feel compelled to see what's beyond it. We always have been. We always will be. And Mars is the next horizon, the one that is just close enough to be imaginable, just far enough to be extraordinary. The question is not whether we will go. The question is whether we will go wisely, with the preparation, the honesty, the scientific rigor, and the moral seriousness that the journey demands. There are 2 more pieces that tie everything together: the real state of current missions and what they're actually teaching us right now, and the final question of what all of this means for how we think about our place in the cosmos. Let's talk about what's actually happening right now. Not the vision, not the roadmaps, not the architectural concepts and the mission proposals and the ambitious timelines. What is literally happening on Mars at this moment? The machines we've sent, the data they're gathering, the questions they're answering, and the new ones they're opening up, because the current state of Mars exploration is, in its own quieter way, as extraordinary as anything the colonization conversation promises for the future. Right now, as you watch this, there are active spacecraft orbiting Mars and operating on its surface that represent the cumulative scientific and engineering achievement of decades of work by thousands of people across multiple space agencies and countries. And what those machines are telling us is reshaping our understanding of Mars in real time, in ways that matter directly for every challenge we've discussed throughout this video. Let's start on the surface. NASA's Curiosity rover has been operating in Gale Crater since August of 2012. Over a decade of continuous operation on the Martian surface, climbing the slopes of a 5.5-kilometer mountain called Aeolis Mons, or Mount Sharp, reading the geological record layer by layer like turning the pages of a 4-billion-year book. Curiosity has confirmed that Gale Crater once held a lake, potentially for millions of years, with chemical conditions that would have been compatible with microbial life as we understand it. It has detected complex organic molecules in ancient mudstones, not proof of life, but the chemical building blocks that life uses, preserved in rock for 3 billion years. It has measured the radiation environment that future astronauts would face. It has characterized the dust, the weather, the temperature cycles. It is, in every practical sense, a robotic geologist doing the kind of fieldwork that would take a trained human scientist a fraction of the time, but doing it continuously, patiently, for years, sending everything it learns across hundreds of millions of kilometers of space to scientists on Earth. Perseverance, which landed in Jezero crater in February of 2021, has pushed the scientific ambition further still. Jezero is a former river delta, a place where an ancient river once flowed into a lake, depositing sediment layer by layer in exactly the kind of environment where, on Earth, microbial life tends to leave behind the most durable biological signatures. Perseverance is collecting carefully selected rock core samples from this ancient delta environment, sealing them in titanium tubes and caching them on the Martian surface for eventual return to Earth. The first step in a joint NASA and European Space Agency Mars sample return campaign that, if it proceeds as planned, would bring Martian rock samples to Earth-based laboratories for analysis with instruments far more sensitive than anything that can be miniaturized for a rover. The scientific community's anticipation around those samples is profound, because the question of whether Mars ever hosted life is one that, given everything we now know about the planet's early history and the robustness of life on Earth, deserves the best analytical tools we have. And the best analytical tools we have are in Earth-based laboratories, not on a rover. If those samples come back, and the Mars sample return campaign has faced significant budgetary and technical challenges that have pushed its timeline further out than originally planned, they could provide the most direct answer yet to the question of Martian biology. Perseverance also demonstrated with MOXIE that oxygen production from the Martian atmosphere is physically achievable, and it carried Ingenuity, a small 4-kilogram helicopter that became the first powered aircraft to fly on another planet in April of 2021. Ingenuity was designed as a technology demonstration intended to make perhaps 5 short flights. It ended up making 72 flights before a rotor blade damage in January of 2024 ended its mission. 72 flights on Mars. That progression from proof of concept to operational aerial reconnaissance tool happened faster than almost anyone expected, and it demonstrated something important, that the Martian atmosphere, thin as it is, can support aerial vehicles if you engineer them specifically for those conditions. Future Mars missions may include fleets of aerial drones capable of covering terrain that rovers cannot reach, scouting landing sites, mapping subsurface features with ground-penetrating instruments in orbit. The picture is equally rich. NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, which has been circling Mars since 2006, carries instruments of remarkable capability, including the high-rise camera, which can resolve features on the Martian surface as small as 25 centimeters across from an altitude of 300 kilometers. High-rise has imaged everything from ancient geological formations to active dust devils to the landing hardware from every Mars mission of the last 2 decades scattered across the surface. It has mapped recurring slope lineae, dark streaks that appear seasonally on steep Martian slopes and were once thought to be evidence of seasonal liquid water flows, though more recent analysis suggests they may be dry granular flows. The debate continues. The European Space Agency's Mars Express, in orbit since 2003, and the more recent ExoMars Trace Gas Orbiter, which arrived in 2016, have been mapping the Martian atmosphere and surface in wavelengths ranging from ultraviolet to radar. The Trace Gas Orbiter is particularly relevant to the astrobiology question. It is specifically designed to detect trace atmospheric gases at parts per billion sensitivity, including methane. Methane is interesting on Mars because it has a short atmospheric lifetime. Ultraviolet radiation breaks it down within a few hundred years, so any methane detected in the current Martian atmosphere must have been produced relatively recently, either by geological processes or, tantalizingly, by biological activity. Curiosity detected methane in Gale crater in quantities that fluctuated seasonally. the Trace Gas Orbiter has had difficulty confirming these detections globally, creating a scientific puzzle that remains unresolved. The source of Martian methane, if it genuinely exists at the levels Curiosity measured, is one of the most actively debated questions in planetary science right now. China entered the Mars Exploration Club in a significant way in May of 2021 when its Tianwen-1 mission successfully delivered the Zhurong rover to the Utopia Planitia region of Mars, making China only the second country after the United States to successfully operate a rover on the Martian surface. Zhurong operated for about a year, characterizing the surface geology and subsurface structure of its landing region using ground-penetrating radar, before entering a dormant mode from which it has not, as of the time this video was made, recovered. The Tianwen-1 mission represents a significant expansion of the international community engaged in Mars exploration, and China has announced ambitions for future Mars sample return missions and eventually crewed Mars missions that add another dimension to the geopolitical as well as the scientific landscape of Mars exploration. The United Arab Emirates contributed their own Mars orbiter, the Hope spacecraft, known in Arabic as Amal, which entered Mars orbit in February of 2021, the same month as Perseverance's landing, making it a remarkable month for Mars exploration. Hope is focused on studying the Martian atmosphere and weather patterns across full diurnal and seasonal cycles, providing a global meteorological picture that complements the ground-level measurements from the rovers. For a space program that launched its first satellite just in 2009, getting a spacecraft to Mars orbit on the first attempt was a remarkable demonstration of what rapidly developing space programs can achieve. What all of these missions share, beyond their individual scientific contributions, is that they are collectively doing something that no single mission could do alone, building a comprehensive, multidimensional portrait of Mars as a system. The atmosphere, and the surface and the subsurface, and the radiation environment, and the chemistry, and the geology and the meteorology, all of these are being studied simultaneously from orbit and from the ground, with instruments of increasing sophistication, by a growing international community of researchers whose combined expertise spans virtually every relevant scientific discipline. And what that portrait is revealing, layer by layer, is a world of extraordinary complexity. Not the simple dead desert that early Mars observations suggested, not the romanticized frontier of science fiction. A genuinely complex world with a deep and turbulent history, with chemistry that continues to surprise, with an atmosphere that behaves in ways that still challenge our models, with a subsurface that we've barely begun to characterize. A world that, the more we study it, the more questions it generates. That is what science does. It doesn't just provide answers, it reveals the shape of our ignorance, shows us where the boundaries of knowledge are and what lies beyond them. Every Mars mission has done this. Viking revealed a surface chemistry that puzzled scientists for decades. Pathfinder showed us a world that could be navigated by a rover. Spirit and Opportunity found evidence of ancient water activity that transformed our understanding of Mars's history. Phoenix confirmed water ice at the poles. Curiosity found organics and measured radiation and characterized habitability in ways that directly inform mission planning. Perseverance is building the scientific case for sample return. Each mission stands on the shoulders of those before it, reaching a little higher, seeing a little further. And here is what all of that accumulated knowledge points toward. When you synthesize it honestly, Mars is worth going to. For the science, absolutely. For what it might teach us about the origin and distribution of life in the universe. For what it would demand of us as engineers and as human beings. For what standing on another world, seeing the sky of another planet, might do to our understanding of the one we came from. But the accumulated knowledge also points towards something else, with equal clarity. We are not ready yet, not in the sense that the goal is impossible or the aspiration is misguided, in the sense that the specific biological, psychological, engineering, and ethical problems we've documented throughout this video remain unsolved to the standard that human lives require. The gap between current capability and mission-ready capability is real, measurable, and not closable on a timescale of years. It requires decades of sustained, well-funded, rigorously honest development work, and in the meantime, every robotic mission we send to Mars is making that eventual crewed mission safer, more informed, more likely to succeed. Every geological sample Perseverance caches is potentially the most scientifically valuable material ever returned to Earth. Every weather observation from Hope, every subsurface radar scan from Zhurong, every atmospheric measurement from the Trace Gas Orbiter is a data point that feeds into the body of knowledge that will ultimately guide human mission planning. The robots are not a consolation prize for the absence of human explorers. They are the essential, irreplaceable foundation on which safe human exploration will eventually be built. There's a tendency in the public conversation to treat robotic and human Mars exploration as competitors, as if the presence of rovers somehow diminishes the case for sending people, or as if the desire to send people makes the robots seem inadequate. That framing is wrong. They are complementary, they serve different purposes and have different strengths. A rover can operate for a decade without needing food, water, oxygen, or psychological support. A human geologist can accomplish in an afternoon what a rover might take months to do. Both of those statements are true simultaneously. The question is not which approach is superior. The question is what combination of approaches, deployed in what sequence, produces the best scientific return and the greatest chance of human survival. The answer almost certainly involves more robots before people, more orbital mapping, more subsurface characterization, more in-situ resource utilization demonstrations at larger scales, more autonomous system testing, more closed-loop life support validation, more radiation medicine research, more human factors work in analog environments. All of that before anyone straps into a spacecraft pointed at Mars. That's not defeatism. That's the same methodical, evidence-based approach that took us from the Wright brothers' 12-second flight at Kitty Hawk in 1903 to the first transatlantic passenger air service in 1939. 36 years of incremental development, of learning from failures, of building the reliability and the knowledge base that commercial aviation required before ordinary human beings could trust their lives to it. The history of aviation is not a story of impatience, it is a story of patience rewarded by capability, of people who understood that getting from aspiration to achievement in a genuinely difficult domain requires doing the work, all of it in the right order. Mars deserves that same patience. The people who will eventually go to Mars deserve it, and we deserve it too, because when humans finally do set foot on Martian soil, we want it to go right. We want them to come back. We want the first crewed Mars mission to be the beginning of something sustained and extraordinary, not a tragedy that sets the entire program back by decades and leaves the dream in the wreckage of a mission that was attempted before the conditions for success were fully in place. The stakes are that high, and the opportunity is that extraordinary, and both of those things are true at the same time, in the same breath, without contradiction. So here we are, 10 parts, hundreds of facts, dozens of ways that Mars wants to kill you, break you, isolate you, irradiate you, suffocate you, poison you, and psychologically dismantle you piece by piece. We've gone through the atmosphere and the radiation and the perchlorates and the dust and the cold and the gravity and the cardiovascular collapse and the immune dysfunction and the neurological damage and the bone loss and the psychological fracturing and the logistical impossibility and the ethical complexity and the transit nightmare and the timeline humility. We've been thorough, maybe brutally thorough. And if you've made it this far, you deserve the truth about why we did all of that. Not to scare you away from Mars, not to argue that the dream is foolish or the aspiration is misguided, but because the dream is important enough to tell the truth about. Because the most respectful thing you can do for an extraordinary idea is to look at it honestly, in full light, without flinching. And what you find when you do that is something unexpected. Something that the relentlessly optimistic version of the Mars conversation, the version full of sleek renderings and inspiring music and bold timelines, tends to skip over because it doesn't fit neatly into a launch campaign. What you find when you take every single obstacle seriously, when you sit with the full weight of what Mars actually is and what a human body actually is, and what the gap between those two realities actually looks like. What you find is not despair. What you find is something that feels almost like reverence, because the fact that we are having this conversation at all is astonishing. Think about what it took to get to this point. Think about the chain of events stretching back nearly 4 billion years that had to unfold in precisely the way it did for there to be creatures on the surface of Earth capable of asking whether they could survive on Mars. The emergence of life from chemistry in the early oceans, the development of photosynthesis, which over hundreds of millions of years transformed the atmosphere and made complex life possible, the evolution of multicellular organisms, of nervous systems, of eyes, of brains capable of building models of the world more detailed than anything that had ever existed in the universe before, the emergence of language, which allowed knowledge to accumulate across generations instead of dying with every individual, the invention of writing, the development of mathematics, the slow, painful, non-linear accumulation of the scientific method, the discovery that the universe responds to careful questions, that nature has rules that can be found and understood, that the cosmos is not arbitrary but comprehensible. All of that, every step of that improbable journey, had to happen to produce the species that now builds rovers and points them at other planets. The species that looks at a world 300 million kilometers away and asks not just what it is, but whether we could live there, whether we should go, what we owe to whatever might already be there, what going would mean for who we are. No other species on this planet does that. No other species we have ever found evidence of anywhere in the universe does that. We are, as far as we know, the only thing in the cosmos that looks at the cosmos and wonders about it. The only thing that asks, the only thing that reaches. That is not a small thing. That is, depending on how you look at it, the most extraordinary thing we know of in the entire universe. And Mars is the next place that reaching has brought us to. Not the final place, not even close to the final place. Beyond Mars lies the asteroid belt, the gas giants and their moon systems, the outer solar system, with its billions of comets and distant ice worlds, and beyond that the incomprehensible distances to the nearest stars, distances so vast that our fastest current spacecraft would take 70,000 years to cross them. Mars is the next step, not the destination. It is the first rung of a ladder whose top we cannot see, but first rungs matter. The way you take the first step shapes everything that follows, and everything we've covered in this video is, at its core, about taking that first step correctly, about understanding what the rung is actually made of before you put your weight on it. So let's answer the question we started with. Why would Mars be a horrible place to live? It would be horrible because every breath would be a technological achievement, because every meal would depend on a supply chain spanning hundreds of millions of kilometers, because your bones would thin and your heart would shrink, and your vision might blur and your immune system would struggle, and your mind would have to do things it was never designed to do. It would be horrible because the dust is toxic and the radiation is relentless and the cold is lethal and the pressure is lethal and the perchlorates are lethal and the isolation is a weight that presses on the deepest parts of what it means to be a social primate evolved for a world of savannas and rivers and other human faces. It would be horrible in ways that are measurable and documented and peer-reviewed and sobering, and it would also be, in ways that are harder to quantify but no less real, extraordinary, because the same thin carbon dioxide atmosphere that cannot support a human breath without a suit also scatters light across the Martian sky in a way that produces sunsets of an almost impossible beauty, sunsets where the sky around the sun glows a cool, ethereal blue while the rest of the sky fades through shades of pink and brown and dusty gold, the exact inverse of an Earth sunset, because the same fine dust particles that scatter red light in our atmosphere scatter blue light in Mars's thin air. The Curiosity rover has photographed these sunsets. They are genuinely beautiful. They are like nothing in the sky of any world a human being has ever stood on. The same low gravity that would slowly dissolve your musculoskeletal system would also let you move across the Martian landscape in ways that are physically impossible on Earth. Bounding strides covering enormous distances with relatively little effort, the ability to stand on the rim of Olympus Mons and look out across a volcanic plateau the size of France, or to stand at the edge of Valles Marineris and look across a canyon system so vast that the far wall, 4,000 meters below and up to 600 kilometers away, would be below the visible horizon even in the clear Martian atmosphere, the same barren, waterless, ancient surface that holds no comfortable place for a human body, holds 4.5 billion years of solar system history, written in layers of rock and dust and ice, waiting to be read by anyone patient and capable enough to learn its language. The same world that would try to kill you in a dozen ways is also a world whose geology has never been walked by human feet, whose ancient lake beds have never been examined by human hands, whose sky has never been crossed by human eyes, looking up at two small moons moving against a field of stars unfiltered by any appreciable atmosphere, stars that don't twinkle on Mars, because the air is too thin to produce the atmospheric shimmer that makes them dance in Earth's sky. This is the truth about Mars that gets lost in both the relentlessly optimistic version and the relentlessly cautionary one. Mars is genuinely, deeply hostile to human life, and Mars is genuinely, deeply extraordinary. Both of those things are true simultaneously, completely, without any contradiction. The hostility doesn't diminish the wonder. The wonder doesn't erase the hostility. They coexist because Mars is a real place, and real places are complicated, and the people who will eventually go there, the first human beings to stand on Martian soil, to breathe recycled air inside a pressurized habitat on another world, to look up at a sky that no human eye has ever looked at directly, those people will know both of those truths in a way that no one watching a screen from Earth ever quite can. They will feel the weight of every suit they wear, and every calorie they eat, and every molecule of oxygen they breathe, and they will also feel something else. Something we've heard approximated in the words of astronauts returning from low Earth orbit, in the accounts of explorers returning from the ends of the Earth, in the testimony of anyone who has ever been somewhere genuinely remote and genuinely demanding and genuinely magnificent. They will feel alive in a way that is hard to feel anywhere else. The specific aliveness that comes from being somewhere that requires your full attention, your full capability, your full commitment just to be there. The aliveness of earned presence, of knowing that you are where you are, not because it was easy or comfortable or safe, but because you prepared for it, worked toward it, and chose it with full knowledge of what it would cost. That aliveness is part of what drives human beings toward the frontier in every era and every context where the frontier has existed. It's part of what drew people across oceans in wooden ships, across continents on foot, into the deep ocean and the high atmosphere and the low Earth orbit that marks the current boundary of direct human experience. The frontier is not comfortable. It has never been comfortable, but something in us is drawn to it anyway, because something in us understands, without being able to fully articulate it, that the edge of what is known and safe is also the edge of what is possible and new. Mars is the next frontier. It is the most demanding frontier human beings have ever attempted. It will require more of us, biologically, psychologically, technologically, ethically, financially, institutionally, than any frontier that came before it. The gap between where we are and where we need to be is real, and measured honestly it is large. But it is not infinite. It is the kind of gap that human beings, when they commit to closing it with genuine seriousness and genuine resources, have a demonstrated historical capacity to close. We went from the first powered flight in 1903 to landing on the moon in 1969, 66 years. In the span of a single human lifetime, our species went from a 12-second hop above the sands of Kitty Hawk to leaving footprints on another world. The pace of technological development since then has not slowed. If anything, across most domains relevant to space exploration, computing, materials science, biology, medicine, robotics, propulsion, it has accelerated. The tools we are building now, the knowledge we are accumulating now, the capabilities we are developing now are laying the foundation for something that from where we stand today looks enormously difficult, but not impossible. And that matters. That matters more than the specific timelines which will slip, or the specific architectures which will change, or the specific technology solutions which will evolve. What matters is that the goal is legitimate, the science is real, the human aspiration is genuine, and the work is being done, imperfectly, unevenly, with detours and delays and setbacks and occasional retreats, but being done. Carl Sagan wrote that we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. Stardust, contemplating the stars, material that was forged in the hearts of ancient suns, scattered across space, gathered by gravity into planets, and on at least one of those planets, ours, assembled over billions of years into structures complex enough to look back at the cosmos and ask questions about it, to write equations that describe it, to build instruments that see it, to feel awe at it, if that is what we are, and the science genuinely supports that description in its most literal sense. The iron in your blood was forged in a stellar core, the calcium in your bones was produced in a supernova. Then Mars is not just a destination. Mars is a homecoming of sorts. It is stardust visiting stardust, carbon-based curiosity examining carbon-bearing rock, the cosmos folding back on itself in one more extraordinary loop of self-examination. We are not going to Mars because it is easy. We are not going to Mars because it is safe. We are not going to Mars because the timeline is convenient, or the biology is forgiving, or the ethics are simple. We are going to Mars because it is the next place the story goes. Because exploration is not a hobby or a luxury or an optional extra that civilizations indulge in when everything else is sorted. It is a fundamental expression of what we are, curious, restless, reaching creatures who have never been able to look at the horizon without wanting to know what's beyond it. And Mars is beyond this horizon. A horrible place to live, yes. A world that will challenge every system of every human body and mind that sets foot there, yes. A destination whose ethical and scientific and logistical complexities we are only beginning to fully comprehend, yes. And also, a world whose ancient geology might answer the oldest question in science. A world whose sky produces sunsets of alien beauty. A world whose very hostility would call forth from the people who go there a level of courage ingenuity, and mutual dependence that represents human civilization at something close to its best. A world whose conquest, not in the military sense but in the oldest human sense of the word, the sense of learning a place well enough to survive in it, would mark one of the most significant transitions in the history of life on Earth. We are not ready yet, we will be. The work between now and then is the most important work in this particular chapter of the human's story, and understanding what that work is, understanding the real challenges, the real biology, the real physics, the real psychology, the real ethics, is not a reason to step back from the dream. It is the dream taken seriously, respected, given the weight it deserves. Look up at Mars the next clear night you have. Find that steady, rust-colored point of light. It doesn't twinkle like the stars because it's close enough, relatively speaking, to show as a disk rather than a point source, and disks don't scintillate the way points do. Just a steady, warm, ancient light in the darkness. A world orbiting the same star we do, carrying its 4 billion-year history in silence. It is waiting, not for us to rush toward it, for us to be ready for it. And that, in the end, is the most honest and the most hopeful thing about Mars. It isn't going anywhere, and neither are we. And if Mars scared you, wait until you see what happens when we aim even further. Check the video on your screen to explore why the journey to Proxima Centauri is scarier than you think. It will completely rewire how you see deep space travel. Click it, you won't regret it.